Hi, I'm Wojtek from Index Ventures, a global venture capital firm that has for the past 25 years been supporting the most ambitious entrepreneurs all across Europe. And today, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our first startup policy event, which we are co-hosting with Slush. Over the next 2 days, we are going to explore what it would take for Europe to become the most entrepreneurial continent. Not Optional started as a startup initiative founded by Index alongside 500 CEOs and founders who called on European governments to reform the punitive policies that govern stock options. And we have made great progress on that front. However, this Thursday and Friday, we're going to look beyond stock options and look at other measures, other practical steps that Europe must take to become the best place to start and build world-changing businesses. The virtual format of this event allows us for the first time to bring together key national and EU policymakers with startup executives, CEOs, and founders at a critical juncture for European tech and Europe as a continent. We believe this is incredibly important with our friends at Slush. And with that, I'll pass it on to the CEO of Slush. Mika, over to you.
Thank you so much, Wojtek, and welcome on my behalf as well, and also on Slush behalf. Slush is all about helping the next generation founders forward. And we believe that to reach the next level in the European startup ecosystem, we have to work together with founders, investors, and also policymakers. And this event is actually all about it. So the event will be going on today until 5:45 Central European Time. And tomorrow we're going to start again 9:30 a.m. Central European Time. So the program is backed by critical stakeholders from the European scene, like John Collison, co-founder and president from Stripe, Sion Keen, chief people officer from Farfetch, David Hinderkus, co-founder and chairman of TransferWise, Eva Kaili, member of European Parliament, and many other incredible speakers. And we'll be talking about and doing deep dives how we are actually doing right now, whether it's data or by some of the best professionals in the industry. We're going to discuss stock options, talent attraction, European IPOs, and much more. But I think it's time to move on to the first discussion, the opening fireside. And let's start with introducing our panelists. Our first guest is Neil Reimer, founder of Index Ventures. And Neil is often called the European startup backer and also considered as the godfather of European venture capital space. Neil founded Index in Geneva in 1996. And today, Index is one of the most prominent venture capital funds in the world, backing companies like Supercell to Adyen to Farfetch, and also in the US soil, companies like Dropbox and Slack. Earlier this year, Index raised $2 billion to support the next generation founders, and also Neil serves as the co-chair of Human Rights Watch, non-profit and non-governmental organization tackling human rights issues around the world. That's Neil. In addition, we have Constantin Van Orange, special envoy at TechLeap NL and ex-head of cabinet at the European Commission. And at European Commission, he served first as an advisor, later as deputy private secretary, and private secretary to the vice president of the European Commission and commissioner of the digital agenda. He has been also a member of high-level group of innovators, and famously has said, "Does anyone know more important to focus on than tech?" So welcome, Neil and Constantine.
Thank you.
So we have 20 minutes, so let's start right away and shift gears a bit. So I want to start talking about the macro perspective of the European startup and tech ecosystem. And in the end, we're here to discuss how to make Europe the most entrepreneurial continent. So what's your assessment of where Europe is actually today in terms of startups, venture capital, and technology? And what if we start with you, Neil?
Thanks, Mika. I first want to correct the record and say I'm one of the founders. There are three of us who are founders, and I don't want to be hogging all the glory from my partners. I think that when I think of where we are today, it's almost beyond what we might have imagined 10 years ago. To imagine that in 2020, you'd have not one, but two European companies that trade at valuations above or around $50 billion. And valuation is one metric. I think of it as a proxy for how ubiquitous your product is, how indispensable your product is. And the world awards you that kind of evaluation. But to think of the fact that we're at that place, that that the number of people working in startups around Europe is growing dramatically and is over 2 million people now across Europe, and that's 40% more than it was just in 2016. That the jobs that are being created by startups are now starting to make a significant dent in the economy. That would have been really hard to imagine 10 years ago, but I'd say we're also just at the beginning of where we're going to be 10 years from now.
Got it. Konstantin, do you share the view of Neil? What's your take on this?
Yeah, I do. I must say I share less the amazement. I think this has been developing for quite a while, and more and more funding has been available over time, and we've seen bigger companies and more unicorns emerging from Europe. I do think it's still vulnerable in a sense that there's still a lot of public money in the system, and the connectivity of Europe is still not very high. So do we really see entrepreneurs go back and become venture capitalists? Do we see governments really interacting with these new types of companies? Do we see that governments fully understand how important this is? I think there's still quite a lot to be done. But on the whole, I'm really proud what's being achieved. And when we set up we first wrote the Startup Manifesto for Europe and set up the Digital Leaders Club with founders of Skype and of Spotify and others. Then when we're really looking for role models in Europe now, I think there are sufficient role models, and these are really becoming very serious companies. And I think now we're not talking about startups anymore, but about a very sophisticated tech sector that is now proving to larger parts of the economy that this is very serious, that these are the jobs of the future, and that these are the companies that will keep us competitive. And then last point, I think COVID has really helped us bring forward a lot of these developments. Everything becoming remote, from education to healthcare to work. A lot of these innovations were already there, but they were not implemented. And now COVID has really accelerated that process.
Got it. You mentioned, Konstantin, about role of governments, and let's come back to that in a second. But before that, maybe I'm curious to understand, like, if we think about the past 20 years, or let's say 10 years, what have been the biggest changes, whether they are good or bad, you have witnessed when you both have worked with startups for many, many years? Maybe, Konstantin, if you can start.
On the government side, I think, when we did the digital agenda, it was seen as a vertical. Like you had electricity or energy, and you had telecoms and transport, and we tried to say this is transversal. It's going to be transformational to all sectors of the economy, of society, and that was just not generally accepted. I think that's now generally accepted. It's now accepted that this is highly strategic, and we might come back to that as well, between the US and China and Europe. In many parts of the world, the IT infrastructure and services on top, the platforms are highly strategic, and that was not the case 5 to 10 years ago. So a lot of that has changed. I think there's a different degree of ambition among governments to support the whole tech system and startup ecosystems. It's been remarkable what the UK has done under Prime Minister Cameron, but also before, and how it has been a bit of an innovation laggard, and now is a leader in venture capital and in tech, but also incredible progress in the Scandinavian countries, in France with Macron being really ambitious and and pumping a lot of money, but also political support into this. And also in my own country, how Amsterdam and many other hotspots in the Netherlands have really embraced tech and have become one of the most important tech hubs in Europe.
Got it. Neil, what is your experience of 25 years of investing to the companies? Like, what are the good and bad changes of working with startups?
I can't really think of too many bad ones, Mika. I can tell you that the level of ambition of entrepreneurs has just ratcheted up every year. And that's not just up to them, it's also the people around them, the teams, but also the investors backing them. There's a level of trust with a growing, an increasingly sophisticated group of investors investing in these companies that convinces management to keep going for a bigger outcome, and management convinces investors that they can go for a bigger outcome. It's kind of this self-reinforcing cycle, but also the flow of talent into these companies out of great companies. 20 years ago, it was really hard to attract people out of career paths at big companies. Today, this is seen as kind of the ideal career path. So the mobility of talent, also geographically, the mobility of talent across Europe, people don't ask questions about moving to Helsinki or moving to Berlin or moving to Barcelona, and remote work obviously helps that. And finally, I'd say the fact that the rest of the world, including the US, investors, public markets, analysts have all discovered European companies and realized that, these companies like that have been mentioned, Skype or Spotify or Adyen, actually emerged from this place called Europe. Who'd have thought that?
Yeah. I want to, those are great points. And also like what Konstantin mentioned early on about governments and maybe the varying role and maybe ambition level, what different governments have and what different countries have. Konstantin mentioned UK, France, Netherlands. And I want to actually talk about like role of governments and policymakers backing the European startup ecosystem and tech ecosystem. So my question is, why is it important, or what is your message? Why is it important for to understand that startups are a strategic priority? And is this like nice to have thing? Is it must to have thing? And how far do you think that we are from that it's actually strategic priority if it's not yet? Maybe Konstantin, if you want to start.
Well, I think you should not look at it as startups. I think it's about technology, and do you want to be involved in the development of technology? And then of course the startups are the companies that bring the technology to the market, and then they create new markets and all that. So that is important in terms of jobs and etc. But your competitiveness, the competitiveness of your economy, depends really if you are on trend with many of these developments. And if you look at where the big transitions are going in terms of the energy transition, food transition, the digital transition, if you're not part of that, if you don't have deep capabilities in AI, and if you're looking forward in, for instance, quantum computing, then you'll miss out. And it's not just about startups, but it's your economy will miss out. And if you don't play in that global game, then the relevance of your country and your autonomy and your sovereignty will be less. So in that sense, it's extremely strategic. The good thing is actually, if you look at countries like Singapore or Israel, but also some European countries, there's actually quite simple things you can do as long as there's a good base. And I think many of our countries have a strong base in science and have relatively stable political environments and economies that can actually support these companies here. And so you need, with some fiscal measures, you need to have open migratory system where you invite talented people to come to your countries. Obviously, you can do a lot in education, but none of this is rocket science. And many of the countries that have been successful have demonstrated what is possible. So basically, if you look around and copy creatively, then countries within I would say a window of 10 years can go from relatively backward to even front runners in this game. But I do think there's now an inflection point where many of those technologies are hitting an exponential curve. So if you miss out now, I think you might miss out for the longer run as well. And therefore, it's really important to be on top of this.
Got it. Neil, do you think that policymakers are willing to change, willing to make the change that you feel is necessary? And kind of like, what is your take on this? Like, is this enough big deal for everyone?
Yeah, I think like any, enterprise, you need a strategy, and a strategy is about keeping the main thing, focusing on the number one priority at the cost of all other things. And I think some countries have been forced to figure that out early. Finland, Estonia, Constantine mentioned Israel, Ireland, for whatever reason, their experience, cycles that they've been through, they've realized, this is the way forward. There are not 5 ways forward. This is not one of 3 things we should be doing. This is the main thing. And maybe somebody else has a better idea, but as far as I know, there is no better way to dynamize an economy. And the good news is that beyond recognizing that and making it a priority, they don't have to do a hell of a lot. They have to make that clear and then just enable the best possible conditions, and entrepreneurs and teams will do the rest. And then they have to just get out of the way and let it happen. Of course, you need, thoughtful regulation so that, things don't go completely nuts. But, with basically some well thought out preconditions and laws around things like stock options, you can go a long way.
Constantine, do you agree with that? Like, just set the scene and let the startups and other players do the work. Like in general, like maybe additional questions that, like Constantine, how do you see what should be the role of governments, especially the funding perspective for technology and startups?
I agree. But it does depend a bit on where you are in the maturity cycle. So if you, in the early phase, you as a government, you want to maybe put more public money into the venture capital system, attracting foreign funds, maybe even doing direct investments, but then going to co-investments, make sure that your venture capital system starts to grow. And we still see that, for instance, also in the country, the Netherlands, that the tickets are relatively small. And that the system's still maturing. So there, the government can still do stuff that is more interventionist, but then eventually you have to pull out. It's a sign of maturity when you have less public money in the system. And then I fully agree. It means not getting in the way. This is difficult though. If you look, for instance, at the whole developments around blockchain and crypto. Governments need to kind of grapple with this new phenomenon, and often, and we've seen that obviously with Uber and the sharing economy, the gig economy, that the existing set of rules are no longer really fitting, and it is really up to government there to determine their position. Are they going to stop this innovation from happening? Are they going to help the legacy providers in their position, or are they going to stand back a bit and see how this development pans out, and then are a bit more modest and humble in terms of intervening? And there I'm completely at the same line as Neil. I hope that they are a bit more humble in the sense that you have to kind of see how this kind of peters out. And once you start seeing where the traction is, then yes, then government has a role again, and you might want to regulate some stuff. But on the whole, I would urge governments to be more focused on looking forward than protecting looking backwards.
Got it. There has been a lot of discussion around Europe versus US versus China. And Neil, you have been investing both to the US and at Europe at Index. I want to hear your view on Europe versus China versus US. Who will win and why? Maybe Neil, if you want to start.
Yeah, I think it's too early to call that race. But I could tell you that I believe that the winner will be the most open. Open to ideas, open to capital, and open to markets. And you can't really have that without rule of law and respect for human rights. I wish that all three major economies you've talked about were equal, but they're not. Just as the US is now going through a cycle where it's closing in on itself, I think that benefits Europe. But there are parts of Europe that are doing that as well. And I don't think they'll participate in this to the extent that others will. China, is a formidable competitor, but I don't see it attracting the greatest talent from all over the world unless it opens up and starts trusting its own people, so that the people can trust the leaders. So I think that all three places have a real shot, but it's not just about startups and innovation here. The framework for the entire economy and civil society there matters a lot.
Konstantin, what do you think?
I mean, I can only applaud what Neil's saying. I think there are currently, Europe has to be careful not to fall between two systems, where you have the US, which is really market driven, and you have which is good because you have market forces working, and then you have China, where it's very state controlled, which also works because you have a top down kind of, but we don't want to be stuck between bottom up and top down by having very strict regulation on one side and not really allowing entrepreneurs to grow on the other. So we do have to find the balance between the two. And I think it's absolutely possible. We're seeing that now in countries that have a long history of social justice and equality, like in the main Scandinavian countries, but also in the Netherlands. Again, I think we have a very strong social support system, which can actually easily stand side by side by very innovative startup and tech scene, and the government does arbitrate between those two. And I think we do sometimes see that the two are put in opposite of each other. That high growth is seen as something which undermines the civil society, and I think those two actually go hand in hand. And we have to be careful, I think, and in Europe, but anywhere, that the tech scene and the tech sector doesn't become a white male dominated sector, but that it is inclusive and that we create many more chances for all talent. And then we come back to the openness that Neil was talking about. It's talent in your society, and it's talent from the outside, that all of that is welcome to produce these incredible companies. And I think that's to the benefit of our all. And it's not just the economy, it's society as a whole.
That's a great answer. We're closing to almost 20 minutes, so I want to end this with two kind of like rapid fire questions with rapid answers, obviously. So let's start with what kind of one message, obviously we have discussed this already a lot, but what one message you would like to say, especially to the European level policymakers, both on EU and governmental level, maybe starting with you, Neil?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I think the good news is you don't have to do a lot, but you do have to decide that this is a priority and then follow best practice. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. And things like Not Optional are helping you do that by highlighting what is best practice.
Konstantin?
I'd advise them to listen to the advice of Neil.
Okay, so final question. This event is all about discussing how to make Europe the most entrepreneurial continent. So the question is, can we make it happen? What do you think?
Yes.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you so much, Konstantin and Neil, for a nice discussion. And we're going to jump really shortly to the next question, next discussion about data and what we can learn about it in terms of this topic. Thank you, Neil and Konstantin, and everybody who was listening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Great. Hi, welcome everybody. I'm Joram Wijngaarden. I'm the founder of Dealroom. And Dealroom is also the co-initiator of European Startups together with Sifted, which is European Startups is a 2-year initiative to promote European startups. So can Europe be the most entrepreneurial continent? So in the next 15 minutes, I'm going to look at the journey so far, look at the present, and also at the future, the next 5 years. So starting with the journey so far, which has been about ditching an old image. So first, why do we need entrepreneurialism? Well, we're witnessing the continued unstoppable rise of tech. Tech is now considered the new oil or the new safe asset. And what you see in this chart is the Nasdaq, which has reached or topped $10 trillion, driven by companies like Apple, Microsoft, Amazon. But you see also a red line going down. So people call this the K-shaped recovery, which really is an acceleration of software eating the world. And this is being led by US and Chinese companies. So all these companies on the right, at least the American ones, are venture backed. And actually, what's not always appreciated is that a huge part of the US economy is now venture backed. So 1.2 trillion of VC has been invested in since 1995. And this has created over 10 trillion in value, but it has also created a lot of jobs. So more than 10% of all the jobs in the US are by VC backed companies. And over 50% of the R&D spending in the US is done by companies that are backed by venture capital. So VC itself is a tiny industry, but it has a huge impact on the overall growth of the economy and also on the resilience. So quickly comparing this to Europe, most of you already know this, but of course, the amount of VC invested in Europe is far less, the amount of value created is far less, but the amount of R&D spending by VC-backed companies in Europe is negligible compared with with the overall R&D budgets, and it's less than 1% of the total jobs. But let's add a time component to this. So most of those big companies I mentioned before, like Amazon, Google, they've been created a long time ago, in a time when the European venture capital almost didn't exist or was really small. So these companies were basically unchallenged by European companies. So in 2005, and that's where you see the green line, venture capital was around 4% of global VC in Europe. And then it started to ramp up. And today it's about 15% of global venture capital happening in Europe. And since then, Europe has created 205 unicorns, almost all venture backed, and has created also a lot of big exits. And if you look at what happened since 2005, you just look at the top 5 most valuable VC-backed companies, the difference actually is only 2.5 times, which sounds a lot more reasonable. Here you compare, for example, Adyen, Spotify, Delivery Hero with companies like Zoom and Uber. And if you look even more recently at the latest generation of entrepreneurs and startups, it's really impressive that 38% of all global seed stage capital is raised by European startups. So you see that on the left. And then on the right of this chart, you see that in later stages, the European market share of startups is much smaller. So just quickly summarizing this first 5 minutes, which is the first section of the presentation. Before 2005, companies like Amazon, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, they were basically unchallenged in Europe. But then there was a second generation of European startups, such as Adyen. So you had Stripe in the US, but there's Adyen in Europe. You have Netflix in the US, but there's Spotify in Europe. You have Uber Eats, for example. Here we have Just Eat Takeaway, Delivery Hero. So that's already a very different story. And then if you look at what's happening today, as I said, 38% of all seed capital is invested in Europe, almost equal to what's happening in the US. So that's the journey so far. So let's look at the present: entrepreneurship, jobs, skills, and innovation. So as a result of these successes, the snowball effect now is in full force. So every European success story has a number of other successes that come out of it. The rise of Berlin can be led back to the Zambra brothers copying eBay in 1999 in Kreuzberg. And so there are stories like this throughout Europe, in France and in the UK. Skype led to Atomico, TransferWise, many set up their new VC firms, etc. So this snowball keeps getting bigger and bigger. And in a way, Silicon Valley is just a bigger snowball that's further down the hill. So what we need to do is make sure that we do not throw many obstacles in the path of the snowball. So for the compounding effect to work, basically employee ownership is key. That's the main takeaway here. And that's also the subject of not optional. Now looking further than just the founders and the entrepreneurs, the workforce, it seems nowadays that everyone works as a startup. And in fact, startups have created 2 million jobs already in Europe. And with startup, I mean companies, VC-backed companies that have been founded since 2000. And they're growing at, the number of jobs is growing at about 10% per year. So it's adding 200,000 jobs roughly every year. And with this growth rate, basically startups are a major contributor to new jobs. In fact, 10% is far faster than any individual sector. And even in absolute terms, startups are starting to become a major contributor to job growth in cities. And what we have seen that even in the pandemic, startups have continued hiring, and many startups have even accelerated hiring. But there's more. So that so far is very positive. There's more that we need to learn from the US, for example, and it's not just about Silicon Valley. In the US, more money is just going into tech. There's faster adoption of technology, and corporates spend much more money on IT. So in other words, the implication of this is Europe needs to get corporates to innovate more and to adopt faster. On the R&D side, things are also, there's a lot to improve. So the two biggest R&D spenders are Amazon and Google. The third biggest R&D spender in the world is Volkswagen. So the point here is not that the US spends more on R&D, because the difference is not even that big. But the point is that corporate R&D spending in the US is dominated by big tech companies that are really investing in the future. Whereas in Europe, R&D is more dominated by industrial companies. For example, Volkswagen spends most of its R&D on combustion engines. And we know also about a brain drain taking place. So AI professors are leaving universities to work for big tech, and those big tech companies are mostly based in the US. So with that, let's talk about the future. So what do we need most in the next 5 years? What should we be doing to help startups? At the seed stage, Europe is doing very okay, actually. We saw that with this 38% percentage that I mentioned earlier, which is very acceptable. And also less capital is needed at the seed stage in general. There are seed funds out there. Perhaps there can be some more seed funds on a national level, but that's something that can be taken care of also on a national level. Also, the graduation rate from a seed stage to a Series A stage company is really low. So the risk is super high, and perhaps it's not the best place for government to be directly involved in picking winners. At least it should be very careful. At the Series A stage, so the second block, there are also plenty of European funds, in fact. But from Series C onwards, the field starts to become a lot thinner. And Series C basically means from 40 million round size. And these are mostly done still by... these are still mostly done by US firms. So European VCs have been raising record amounts of new funds, including Index Ventures, Atomico, Lakestar, and especially what you can see is that has been especially happening at seed and Series A stages. But European startups need at least 3 times more capital than that already today. And so all that additional capital is coming from additional investor groups from like US and Asian VCs, growth, private equity, sovereign wealth funds, corporates, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that, and in fact that is a positive, but much bigger tech companies will be built in the coming years, needing more and more funding. What you see here is that companies like Spotify have basically created big companies in areas that are actually very small markets compared with other potential markets. Even food delivery is only a fraction of the economy, and tech is now starting to penetrate more fundamental parts of the economy like healthcare, banking, education, and housing, which need much more capital. So what should the role of the government be? Where should the government provide support? Well, Europe already has institutions and programs in place to provide support. You can see almost every European country has a fund of funds system, and also on the European level there is the EIF, which has been quite successful. There are innovation programs, so grants. Most countries have equity co-investing schemes, debt co-investing, tax credits, etc. So there is already a lot of infrastructure in place. So what should happen with that? So it is often said that Europe is strong in deep tech. And what I showed earlier is that we're actually entering now an age of AI in the coming years. So does that mean that that is where the government should focus? So yeah, deep tech is really cool, and companies like UiPath, GraphCore, DeepMind are really cool. But you know, what's also really cool is TikTok, and TikTok alone is worth more than all of European deep tech combined, depending how you define deep tech. So it's been said many times, I think, that Europe is good at innovation, but bad at commercialization. And this starts with the idea of what a startup is, and what tech is, and what innovation is. So let me explain what I mean. So what do companies that dominate their market have in common? So look here, these are the major categories like search, social, online advertising, all dominated by a handful of usually American companies. So if you look at how those companies started, they made something people didn't realize they needed, but ended up loving to use. So they built up a huge demand for their product. And companies like TikTok prove that it's possible to break in. So these are not monopolies in a classical sense. Consumers can choose between Google and Bing, for example, but they choose Google because they think it's the best product. So basically, these are all products that people love to use. So what should we really be building? So maybe this is thought-provoking to some and obvious to others, but we should not just be building deep tech. It's more important to build things that people love to use, and this is sometimes missing from the initiatives. And in Europe, I think we like to do things in style, and that's fine. So it will be great if we can also solve some of our biggest challenges, like climate change. But we should never forget about the commercial component, and maybe we should even put that first. Because what you saw in the R&D data is that bigger companies get bigger R&D budgets in the end. And so they will be able to solve complex issues with deep tech, but the commerce comes first. So to finalize and conclude my presentation, I would recommend, yes, to attracting and incentivizing talent, including stimulating employee ownership. And Europe probably also needs more late-stage capital, for which fund of funds are probably the best vehicle. What we should be wary about is about government picking winners or creating deep tech without a strategy or commerce behind it, and penalizing exits or employee ownership. So to finish off, creating an entrepreneurial ecosystem maybe sometimes feels like a chicken and egg problem. So which comes first? Well, the answer is probably neither, because both the chicken and the egg are a commodity soon anyway. So what comes first is aggregating demand for the egg through a superior user experience. And for that, you need brilliant entrepreneurs. Thank you.
Good afternoon from where I am in Berlin today, and thank you for joining us from wherever you may be. I'm so pleased to be part of this exciting discussion today called Making Startups Strategic Priority for Europe, What Will It Take? We have an esteemed lineup of panelists today who don't need too much introduction, so I'll keep them short. Joining me today, we have Dr. Jörg Kukies, the State Secretary at Germany's Federal Ministry of Finance. We have two members of European Parliament. We have Eva Maidel and Eva Kiley, and we have Gerard de Graaf, Director for the Digital Single Market in Directorate General, Communications, Networks, Content and Technology. So let's dive straight in. Entrepreneurs and executives at some of Europe's most successful technology startups have urged local governments to change laws to make employee stock options more attractive in order to better compete with Silicon Valley. I'd like to direct my first question to Dr. Kukies about employee stock option schemes. Is this a strategic priority in Germany? And can we see employee stock option schemes become a pan-European movement?
I can obviously only speak for us in Germany, and I would clearly answer with yes. The German coalition government has agreed that this will be implemented during this legislature, and we will stay true to our word. And we are currently working with our friends and colleagues in the Economics Ministry on preparing a draft for legislation, and that will be out within a matter of days rather than weeks. So we are very, if I'd been a bit more lucky, I could have presented you the sort of intro with the content. Unfortunately, we're still in the final stretch of coordination, but we're very far advanced, and will present a piece of legislation that will include incentives to increase the distribution of shares to startup employees, but it will contain more to incentivize startup investments in our country as well. So this is an important question, but it's not the only question.
I'm very excited to hear that we've got a bit of breaking news first thing on the panel about kind of, the legislation kind of coming within a matter of days. That's very encouraging to the startups in Germany and the ecosystem here. To what extent, what has kind of helped you drive that ambition also to kind of make stock in, employee stock options schemes a priority in Germany?
Well, being in Berlin helps because obviously we have a very large ecosystem of startups traveling to Munich, Hamburg, Düsseldorf, other countries, other cities in our country, Frankfurt and many others helps as well. So I think it's a very obvious topic. When we took office in Germany, we do have a problem which is called among experts dry income, where you get essentially, if you have an illiquid ownership stake, you get taxed immediately, but obviously you can't sell anything to account for that and to pay it. So basically you're trapped with a liquidity outflow and an illiquid asset, so that you have a problem of matching the cash outflow with the wealth creation that you have. And that really was highlighted by many startups, investors in startups, law firms, tax experts as a fundamental problem of startups to attract talent. And so we've been working hard to find a rule that would work on the one side, but also avoid abuse and be still compliant with the EU state aid laws, which is also very important.
To what extent has this legislature been kind of, done in conjunction or in discussion with CEOs and entrepreneurs from the local ecosystem?
Oh, massively. I mean, we of course need the input, and we're very keen to understand the input. And what's very encouraging is that the community of startups and their advisors very well understood that this is not a free-for-all. We need rules that also avoid, tax arbitrage, that avoid social contributions to be curtailed. So in that sense, we found a very receptive group of startups that we had very intense discussions with, and yeah, hopefully the result that we'll present shortly will be a good thing that increases the competitiveness of the German market and gets more startups to come to our country.
Well, I'm sure there are many people on this list dialed into this panel today who are very pleased to hear that. I'd like to bring in, our panelists on the continent. Maybe, with you, Eva, Kylie, to what extent, let's, sticking with the idea of stock option schemes, to what extent we're seeing Germany making an effort with it, we're seeing France making an effort with it, to what extent can we see stock option schemes in Europe become a pan-European movement?
Well, thank you so much for having us and discussing about how we can make Europe an environment where you cannot just be here, be creative, be innovative, but also to scale up. And the stock option schemes enable employees to be credited with actually the rewards of a successful startup journey. And if we have also a functional IPO scheme for, sorry, am I still on? Yes, okay, sorry. So together with functional IPO schemes and stock options arrangements could be key motivators to attract top-level digital talent. So we are trying to attract talent now because this was not the case in Europe. SMEs and startups were not able to offer such arrangements in comparison to US and China. And therefore, it was actually creating an imbalance of attracting talent globally. We had the huge brain drain we've been talking about. So the Commission's proposal to member states for a startup nations standard promotes, I think, favorable employee stock options arrangements and visa processing to reduce cross-border friction for entrepreneurs starting and growing businesses in the bloc. And I think this is a huge change, even as a mentality for Europe. And we also have, we're changing also the rules that govern employee ownership. I view that it's served by many, I think it was like 30 CEOs that they mentioned that. For example, TransferWise, Get Your Guide, Revolut, Delivery Hero, these are big companies, European companies, that they face these problems. And I think by making it easier to start a business and expand across borders and attract talent, it could be a new standard to level the playing field with powerful global tech hubs of US and China. Let's not forget that I think Alipay already acquired a license to enter the European market in Luxembourg. And I would say we don't have the time or the option to avoid it. We have the momentum of support, and I think this is how we're going to reach scale and compete globally to change the employee ownership.
It's interesting that you talk about kind of talent and talent retention. I mean, that's a topic that I'd also like for us to touch on. Maybe I can bring in Eva Meidel on this. I mean, let's talk about the link between the difficulty for startups to create wealth and talent retention. Ms. Meidel, how important is it for the European startup culture in talent migration?
So I'm very often called to actually speak about talent migration. I tend to even call it that we are actually already now facing a global war for talent. And the reason why I use this kind of strong wording is because I think one of the underlying principles for startups to prosper and for startups to even be a strategic priority for Europe is to make sure that we invest well in advance into our talents, that we manage to retain the talent, but we also attract talent. So if we want to have a successful startup ecosystem, talent is one of these components that we are unable to basically not have in order for us to facilitate the growth of startups.
Slightly controversially, I was reading some comments on a thread advertising this panel, and I'd like to read one to you and get your reactions from it. Maybe we can bring in Mr. de Graaf for this, but so one of the comments on this thread advertising this panel said, for so many reasons, Europe has absolutely no chance to become the most entrepreneurial continent. And there were many comments, similar to this vein, talking about how it's difficult for Europe to become a real entrepreneurial ecosystem. Mr. de Graaf, why do you think that there is this lack of belief in Europe's startup ecosystem, and how do we change this perception?
Yeah, well, I think I don't agree that in Europe we have less entrepreneurial talent than, for example, in the US or in China. We have actually kind of more companies in Europe per capita than in the US and in China. So I think that's a prejudice that obviously, I mean, we have seen that particularly in the technology area that Europe has not been as successful with the startups and the scale-ups as the US has been. But that is kind of, I don't think we should be extrapolating the past into the future. We need definitely to do better. And I think the role for governments is to put in place the framework conditions that allow the startups not only to start, but then to scale up. And that has everything to do with the issues which we discussed. It's about talent, which we have in Europe, but not enough. We need to retain them. We need to attract talent from outside. It's about the access to finance. It's the incentives in the system. And it's access to markets. I mean, we have a situation of complicated laws and legislation still across the European Union. So even if you're a successful startup, say in Germany, and you want to expand, because that's what it is all about, particularly in the internet economy, it's about scale and speed. You go to France, you go to Italy, it's effectively like starting up again because the rules are different. And that is something that we as governments, we can do something about. We can, and this is where the single market, for example, is incredibly important. It is still too fragmented. The rules are still different. We have no choice. I think that's the important thing. I mean, this is not like, well, what can we do? It's what must we do? I mean, if you look at the ambitions of the European Union, particularly also post-COVID, very much around climate change, green sustainability, very much around digital sovereignty. Let's not forget we need growth and we need more of it in order to pay back the debts. We have still the demographic challenge that we're facing. How are we going to succeed without startups? And I think that's there for the critical question. Maybe in the whole COVID period, particularly in the beginning, startups were a little bit forgotten. But I think now there's a realization that kind of the startups, and not just the startups, I mean, we're not going to, say, dislodge or compete effectively with a very large, particularly technology, again, US or Chinese companies, just by startups. We need to think ecosystems much more in Europe. It's the combination of the startups, the medium-sized, larger companies which we have in Europe, and particularly in areas where we are strong. In technology, we go into the industrial internet. We go into public services like health, transport, energy, education, areas where Europe is traditionally very strong. So I think we need to be a little bit more confident in ourselves and not kind of come with like, well, it will never work in Europe because somehow Europeans are kind of in their DNA, have less entrepreneurial spirit than people in the US or in China. I mean, I think it's wrong. I mean, that's just a fallacy.
I just want to catch on this point of what you said about, startups being slightly forgotten, maybe a little bit kind of during the COVID age. I mean, I can speak kind of, better from a German perspective, given this is where I'm based. But I mean, we've seen that the government has made kind of massive steps to try and help, create financial instruments for startups to help navigate, through this pandemic. Dr. Cookies, like, to what extent did the finance ministry and the economy ministry really realize that the startups, are part of the backbone of Germany's economy? In order to thrive, they need that financial instrument to help navigate through the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, we made a resolution at the beginning of the crisis that no startup will fail because of this crisis. And we do what we can to address that. I.e., we set up very quickly a €2 billion facility of a matching fund where we can invest up to 70% of a financing round through KfW Capital. We're working on, as a follow-up to the 2 billion, a 10 billion future fund, which will continue the work of the KfW Capital program and of course expand it massively and increase the size and go into overdrive on really investing substantial amounts of money into business models of startups, pari passu always with private investors. I think that's the important thing. We don't pretend like the government has the magic sauce and knows anything about valuation or decisions on investments. We do want to co-invest with investors who know what they're doing, but we want to expand the volume and the size massively. But we also want to make sure that the investors that are good at this find it attractive to locate in Germany, and that'll be the second part of our legislation that we're planning i.e. also to give incentives to venture investors to come to Germany, to set up shop here, to move people and capacity to Germany, and to liven the ecosystem even more. And we're doing the same thing at the European level, by the way.
Can we talk a little bit more about what those incentives might be?
We're going in the direction of, on the one side, facilitating the setup, on making sure that the tax regime is equivalent and advantageous, and that our fund laws are competitive at the European level, in terms of setting up funds, in terms of managing funds, and you will see all of the details very soon.
Do you think we'll kind of see, you know, the way we've seen in Canada and in certain places in kind of Scandinavia, where some of, you know, the biggest pension funds and sovereign wealth funds, you know, have really kind of digging deep into their pockets to invest, you know, into private equity and into venture capital? That's something that we haven't seen, you know, on a massive scale in Germany, if at all. Do you think that that's a culture that we could see change?
Yeah, I mean, we're looking to give incentives for that, and the 10 billion future fund that we're setting up is being set up in close cooperation with some of our large institutional investors, because we want to crowd in private money, not crowd it out. So I think that's extremely important. And we're and again, that I would completely agree that Europe has great examples of that. You know, in Sweden that works very well, in Holland that works very well, just to name 2 countries. So I think we're trying to learn the best practices from Europe, and I think that's extremely important, because you know, we're working very closely with the European Parliament and Commission to Europeanize these ideas. For example, we agreed in April already on a 200 billion euro facility for the European Investment Bank, that through EIF, the European Investment Fund, a large part of the 200 billion program will be deployed for pan-European investment into startups, because I think we need to think European in this, and I completely agree. We need to get rid of the fragmentation of our markets, because the American and Chinese startup has a much bigger internal market for services than a European startup.
Ms. Meidel, I'd like to kind of get your view on kind of, you know, why it is that you think that, you know, from a scale perspective, you know, we in Europe haven't been able to scale the businesses to the level of businesses in Europe and in the US and Asia. And secondly, do we need to have businesses of scale, or is it enough for the startups that are based in Europe to just work with the big tech out of US and Asia?
So first of all, I think it's important for us to have a very well-established startup ecosystem to start with. But there's no way we could just be successful if we do not have scale-ups, and if we do not have you know, a concrete way of how we want to see those startups grow. And I think as one of the signatories of the startup and the scale-up manifestos in Europe over the past couple of years, I have to say that we actually have very concrete examples of how we can make sure that those scale-ups are not just, you know, one in a thousand, so to say, but they're more often seen across Europe. I also contributed to a report on Innovate Europe, which is extremely focused and exactly focused on the scale and the competitiveness factor. And I think we kind of came up with 3 main points. One is the funding for large-scale innovation. This is a big requirement, ideally across all stages, with very transparent, with very clear conditions, and in sufficient amounts. In the industrial sector, for example, it's best prepared for digitalization and are often capital intensive. We also need to foster the cross-sectorial collaboration between the startups. European companies could establish, for example, a cross-sectorial platform that allow players from larger corporations or SMEs to collaborate and to provide access to key capabilities, to analytical tools, to data, to standardized interfaces with smaller companies and startup companies. And also, I think it's very important for Europe to create places where different tests and experiments can so to say, happen, different type of sandboxes for key technologies, if we speak particularly on the technological front, for example. But also to help us grow, I think completing the capital markets union, it's absolutely a necessity, because we currently indeed have different schemes where startups could have access to, but completing the CMU will be absolutely key and beneficial for all these smaller players that have the potential to grow. And I think last important point is, I think in Europe we should know better the startups that we have and their potential. And I think very often we know way too little, even as policymakers. And it's a very important, I mean, one could call it, have a deputy minister on startups, for example. Or something that is so focused on finding these good examples and helping them grow and finding ways of how this talent and good ideas could be grown.
I think this might be a good opportunity to bring in Mr. de Graaf. I mean, let's talk about kind of the role that the Commission has to play in digitalization and, you know, this Startup Nations initiative that the EU is developing. Can you give us a bit of an insight on that? Oh, you have to unmute.
Thank you, Sarah. I think that's relevant here. And Eva Kaili already, I thank her for that, to refer to the Startup Nation standard. I mean, we don't always have to look to Silicon Valley to find success and good practices. We actually, and I think we already identified a number of very good practices, and I also congratulate the German government, like on what it's doing on the stock options. The idea behind the Startup Nation standard is, if we would take all the best practices in Europe, in the different member states, and we would make them the standard, we would make them the norm in Europe, so that, I mean, we spread success, how that would help kind of create a kind of environment in which startups can thrive, they can scale up, they can actually grow and become not just European success stories, but global success stories. So what we've been doing with, and the Commission made some announcements on that over the last few weeks, for a few months, is to work with the member states, work with the startup community and say, well, tell us, what are the best practices that have worked? And then we'll put them all together. We give examples like stock options in these member states, it's working. And then we get the ministers together, beginning of next year under the Portuguese presidency, have them sign a declaration, which we've used in the past, we call it digital declaration. And then we start monitoring and measuring kind of how member states are doing. And if you kind of fulfill or you meet all of the standards, there are probably about 10 of them, you can call yourself a Startup Nations. And then if we do all of that together, we are a startup continent. And I think that should be the aim. We have a distributed system in Europe. We don't have like one center in Europe, like even the US doesn't have that, but like Silicon Valley. There is a lot of interesting and dynamic activity like in Bulgaria and Romania. And of course, there will need to be some concentration, some specialization like you see in Berlin. But we have a different model in the European Union. But with the Startup Nations, we will give chances to startups wherever they are. And that is what is behind it. We'll be coming forward with some public announcements very shortly on that.
I think it's fair that, you know, to say that during the pandemic, digitization has, you know, been expedited a little bit, you know, let's say, you know, with the use of things like payments or telemedicine, you know, for people that may have initially been reluctant, you know, with regard, say, in Germany to data protection, with the, you know, Corona warning app, you've still had, you know, a decent adoption rate for people who have, you know, usually been quite concerned about, you know, the sense of kind of data and what these companies do with them. Ms. Kaili, can you just give us a bit of a sense of what you think, you know, startups, the role that they have to play post-pandemic as we navigate now through, hopefully, you know, towards the out of the crisis?
Yes, so basically under the pandemic and until now, we have billions of people, I think around 4, that have actually been quarantined in 2020 because of the pandemic. And the restriction of movement has pushed also the digital sectors to grow exponentially. I think it was a real catalyst in the same period. And we have teleworking and video conferences platforms that have actually even tripled in size. and some even more. I think we have new unicorns coming up. We have e-commerce and food delivery doubled in size, gaming, esports, educational technology, the online courses. They have seen an exponential growth during this pandemic, and startups, they have been at the forefront of helping to solve the problems that this pandemic created. As they are more adjustable, they're more resilient, as I said, especially the innovative ones. They have a more flexible business model in order to change how they are working, and they have played a significant role for the development of vaccine. We saw an Italian company developing the designs of something that you can 3D print and create a ventilator at a normal mask in order to help the lack of ventilators at the beginning of the pandemic. We saw other startups and applications that changed into tracing applications very fast, I think in Estonia, and several European startups that managed to do that. And the European Union has actually funded open hackathons to do that, to fund good ideas, innovative ideas. And these are just the examples of how they managed to address this problem. I think in Germany, for example, none of the 2 billion package that I heard of industrial support has gone to startups. So I think as government spending and involvement in the market increases, the risk will be that governments will pick industrial champions to protect from competition without maybe supporting enough the startups. I'm at the board here of the Startup Alliance, and we are trying to find more ways and to be more demanding into how also the member states should deploy a strategy to support them. So I think in the end, even if Europe is the one who we expect to change very fast its strategy, the startups will become central in the recovery efforts of Europe post-COVID. And I think this ecosystem must be supported now with digital innovation hubs and to enable to have innovators and entrepreneurs with the needed resources and guidance to bring innovation to market. And then we have to remove, to simplify the rules and to remove the barriers that we have of the regulation in order to allow them to flourish and take advantage of, as I've also said, the capital market unions and the digital single market to make it a real single market. This is a disadvantage we have in comparison with US and China.
Ms. Kylie, I saw Dr. Cookies smirking at the comment you made about the capital only going to industrial businesses. I mean, Dr. Cookies, what's your counter to that?
Sorry, Eva, no, it's not true. We have, of course, yes, our economic stabilization fund made quite substantial investments in Lufthansa and TUI and other sort of traditional companies to save them and save employment. That's true. But the 2 billion that we reserved for the startups is going exclusively and only to startups. In 5 months, we've already spent over 1 billion of the 2, and we're working hard on getting the second billion spent also, and mark my words, we'll get it done, and we'll get it done within a few months. And then we have the next 10 billion fund waiting for the approvals. We have the commitment for budgetary means for 21 already, so we will spend the money and we'll spend it intensively.
I'm very happy that we've cleared that up. I'm very, very conscious of time, so I would like to give you each, let's say, an elevator pitch moment to pledge, or to talk about what pledges you can make today or in the new future to make sure that European startups will remain a priority. So Dr. Cookies, your elevator pitch.
Yes, we haven't spoken about migration, and I think that's a key opportunity for Europe. If we attract talent from around the world, if you look at the success rate and the amount of globally inspired and founded startups in the US and their success rate, I think the European Union needs to be very pro-migration. We passed a law last year that will allow, in addition to our humanitarian migration system that is working very well and that we're very proud of, also a qualification-based migration system where whether you're in whichever profession you're working in, but including technology and programming and IT and any startup relevant profession, you can get a visa in Germany to work and to come here to set up your company And I think that's something that we need to expand across Europe and open our doors towards talent.
Thank you. Ms. Maidel, the same question for you. What's your pledge?
Well, I just want to bring in a number. I know numbers are not the best way to end the conversation, but I think we are so many of us familiar with the State of the European Tech Report by Atomico. And 85% of European startups and their founders say that they care about the social environmental impact of their companies, the ones that that are operating here in Europe. And I think what is even more optimistic than this number is that investors are backing up that commitment. So more than 4 billion euros have been invested in purpose-driven European companies, the ones that are, working on key challenges like fighting climate change, ensuring affordable and also clean energy, improving the health sector, creating sustainable cities, communities with zero hunger, and so on and so forth. And I'm bringing this up now at the very end because I think we really truly need to know our startups better. And we need to understand the solutions they're providing, because just to build up on what the previous two speakers said, I think it's about time that we put our money also where our mouth is. So we're going to have an incredibly big recovery package, and we need to make sure that a big chunk of this funding goes into not the old industries that are not willing to reinvent themselves, but to the ones that are exactly wanting to reinvent what's coming ahead and make our economies way more agile and way more prepared for any sort of crisis or any sort of challenge that will come up. And European startups have shown that they're ready and up for that challenge because they're having their bright ideas exactly tackling those issues. So I would like to see a little bit more investment and more strategic investment in this sort of key sectors where startups are being very active.
Well, it's a good thing that Germany's not spending all that money on the old school industrial businesses. So we've got a bit of innovation and less risk, or a bit more, open to risk. Miss Kylie, the same to you. Elevator pitch on your pledge.
Well, I think we forgot to mention just the fuel of innovation and digitalization, which is data, and the lack of access to data that startups have. So what I think we need, besides everything, and I agree, and I'm happy that money went into, because there are like billions spent in the traditional sector, but I'm happy that some went to the startups. We need to give them also access to good quality of data in order for them to function. And this means we need to create common standards and low risk and high risk in order for them to very fast have access to this data in order to be to use them and actually succeed to become innovative and find solutions or like take decisions based on those data. This is something that you can find in US, you can find in China, but not in Europe because of the different languages, systems. So we have ECDC, the Agency for Control, Disease and Prevention, the European, has 80% data in their hands, but they are so different, like the standards that they've been used, so they are not useful for the COVID, for the pandemic. So imagine if we had access to good quality of data and we could actually have startups to be able in a trusted environment to use them and try to understand how this pandemic is it's functioning, how this virus is, what pattern does it follow. I think it's very important to achieve that, and this is why this year we're working on several legislative files, the data strategy for data sets, governance, artificial intelligence, ethical framework, and we are creating a trusted and secure identity. So I think it's very, very important that we manage to give them also the necessary tools, digital skills, as we said, and of course, investment opportunities. So I think this would be the great combination to achieve more innovation in Europe.
Thank you so much. Mr. de Graaf, you've got the final word.
Yeah, I think let's think about what we're good at in Europe. I mean, if you're a startup, you want to change the world. You want to have an impact on the world, on things around you. We're kind of facing tremendous challenges in the world about sustainability, about climate change, about inclusion, about kind of growth in general. I think the agendas of the European Union and the agenda, or at least the ambitions, the aspirations of startups are very much aligned. We need a lot of innovation, eco-innovation, green tech innovation, technology innovation, in healthcare, smart energy, smart transport. So I think in Europe, that's actually where there's a vision, there is a framework, there's clear objectives set out for the next, say, 20, 30 years where we want to go, and startups are an incredible important part of the success. One message maybe to the startups is to think European from the outset. I mean, when I meet startups, it's often they think really very national, or they think, look, well, when can we go to the US? When are we going to be kind of acquired by a big US tech platform? I think more and more startups need to think like our future is in Europe, and we need to think European from the outset, not as some kind of afterthought, like after being successful at the national level.
Thank you so much. I'm getting shown the virtual finger to wrap up, so I would like to take a quick second to say thank you for joining me today and for everyone else that has tuned in around the world. Thank you.
Congratulations, Sarah, and for everybody for Slush. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this session where we're going to dive into the importance and regulation of employee stock options across Europe. So my name is Dominic Jackerson, and I'm the VP of Insight and Talent at Index Ventures. And I'm delighted to be joined by 4 expert voices for this session. So we have Liz McCarthy, who is CEO of Scale Island, which is the policy voice for high growth tech startups and scale-ups. And prior to setting up Scale Island, Liz held a variety of roles at Startup Hub Dogpatch Labs, and she's also worked at 2 fintech startups. And next we have Petrus Zilgelvis, who's head of unit for digital innovation and blockchain in the European Commission. And his unit also includes Startup Europe. And he's also co-chair of the European Commission's FinTech Task Force. And we have Andris Berzins, who's managing partner of Change Ventures, which is a seed fund focused on backing Baltic founders. He's played a key role in developing the Baltic ecosystem for over a decade. And before that, had a career as an executive across US, UK, and Israeli startups. And finally, Gloria Bauerlein, who's VP of the German Startup Association, which is the policy voice of the German ecosystem. And she's also COO of BAC, a Berlin software startup. And I can also say prior to that, when you go back in her career, she was also a colleague of mine for 3 years when she was an investor at Index. And it's nice today to actually be able to say I know all 4 panelists, which is rare and very nice. So we're a little family here. Anyway, I'm going to crack straight into our questions. And Gloria, I thought I'd kick off with you. So I wanted to ask, is there really a talent bottleneck in Europe? And if so, why? Given we produce more technical graduates in the US, we have a smaller tech sector, but we always hear that we still have a talent bottleneck. So, you know, is this true? And how do you experience it?
I think there's always a talent bottleneck. And if you ask global entrepreneurs, they will always tell you the #1 priority is finding and hiring talent, right? But actually, I think there is no bottleneck specifically in Europe. It's not a European specific problem. I actually think it could be a European advantage. Because as you alluded to, there are about 6 million developers, professional developers in Europe, whereas there are only about 4 million in the US. Germany alone has 50% more developers than whole of Silicon Valley. So I don't think that's the problem. I think the problem lies somewhere else. I think there are probably 2 main challenges. One is access to experienced talent that have experience scaling technology companies. We're dealing with a lot of uncertainty. So having experience with like how to do things, how to scale a software company is really, really important. And I think that's a bottleneck today. And the other one is really a willingness to take risks. How can we solve that? We can solve that by making the prerequisites to attract talent as simple as possible, such that we can attract people that have experience over from the US, over to Europe, and really either start companies here or help scaling companies here. And we can do that by creating an European ecosystem that works together and exchanges ideas, shares best practices, rather than really working separately. So as you know, I've worked in London, Stockholm, and Berlin, and I'm starting to see that there's not really a lot of connection between the different ecosystems. So I really think we can improve there. And we can also encourage people to take more risks and tell the success stories of companies to make people really want to join startups and really like innovate or drive innovation rather than joining BMW or Mercedes in our case.
Sure. Thank you very much, Gloria. And Andris, how's that talent bottleneck that Gloria described been a challenge for startups that you've worked with in the Baltic region?
Yeah, so as Gloria said correctly, talent is a bottleneck everywhere. In some sense, we're not unique, but there are some certain things that are a little bit different in Europe. So versus the experience I have in the US with Israel, especially. So in continental Europe, there's traditionally been many more people from the IT industry working in salaries in larger corporations. And so much more of a focus on salaries and options is a relatively new thing. That's changing. And what changes it is the big success stories you see that Reimer was talking about, the Spotify success and so forth, which is inspiring people that there could be value to this. So even the lowly programmer who's maybe getting a small stock option grant is actually now thinking about it differently, that may potentially actually have some value someday. And so that is having a different effect on how people are thinking about their compensation. So naturally they're asking the questions, all right, so here, am I getting the same kind of advantages that Silicon Valley programmers or UK programmers would get, say? And so that's what's driving the question around stock options. And for our region, especially, one of the key challenges is we need to import talent as well. So as Gloria correctly said, experienced talent is in most demand. And in this region, we have some really great success stories, but still not that many. And so especially getting experienced talent here, having good stock option packages is a key part of that sort of conversation with that talent.
Absolutely. And Liz, how does what Andreas said resonate for you in thinking about the Irish ecosystem by comparison?
Well, agreed with everything Andreas said. It's something that isn't on the radar for a lot of employees that startup founders are looking to attract. Oftentimes it isn't a big part of the conversation. So I think that's where the policy needs to change first in order for those startups to be able to offer well-structured packages that can attract that kind of talent. But here in Ireland, the kind of experience we have is we actually have an awful lot of talent on our doorstep. A lot of people have come to work for very large multinationals. To Gloria's point, there's a difference between talent that has no experience and talent that has experience. But for our startup and scale-up sector, attracting those kind of people from those multinationals who can offer very significant compensation packages is a challenge for startups. You really have to work hard to sell that opportunity. And that's where genuinely the share options piece can be a huge tool for Irish startups to be able to attract that kind of talent to scale and sell their product globally.
Absolutely. But I was just curious, can any of you, just sort of to make it real or personal, can anyone provide a sort of personal example of stock options either enabling or preventing you from hiring a great person into a startup that you've been involved with? Just if there's anything live or just tangible there, just for anybody really.
Sure, I can jump in there. Dominic, I know I shared with you some kind of feedback from one of our key startup founders who's helped us develop, who was recently acquired by Google back in January, and a commitment that he had made was to give share options to every one of his employees, and that definitely helped attract them the right employees, leading to that acquisition ultimately. But the thing is that he had the experience of previously setting up a startup and being successfully acquired. So he personally had a lot of wealth to bring to the table, a lot of knowledge and experience, and he had the kind of investment that he could spend on professional services to actually offer that share options package. Whereas a lot of startups don't have that kind of starting point. Maybe it's their first time around, they don't have that kind of capital to spend on those kind of specialist advisory services. So that's a case in point.
Absolutely. So when you look, actually, Liz, just staying with you, with the Irish government's been took steps early at the beginning of the year to try and improve the keep stock option scheme. I mean, in your view, have they done enough, or is there still more that they need to do? What's your take on that?
I think echoing Gloria's point at the beginning, there's never enough done. Once one country makes a move on something, another's going to make another move. For us, we would say there's never an end point in our journey of improving the policy environment for startups. So that's just to keep in mind. But from the Irish government's perspective, one move they did make that we had asked for was to enable part-time employees to be granted, in our case, it's keep share options. So they did that, but actually, you still have to be working 20 hours a week in order to be eligible for keep shares. And as anyone working in the startup space, for some of the most important and experienced people to bring to help you scale, oftentimes they're working less than that. So it's a case of a key point for us would be for the government to engage in a more proactive manner to really understand what are the needs and why would you need maybe a different approach to that scheme.
Yeah, and Gloria, we sort of know that historically Germany has been poor when it comes to stock options policy, and it was very exciting just hearing in the last session words from the finance ministry like hinting tantalizingly that the German government's about to make some major reforms. I mean, what from a German perspective do startups want from the government, and how confident do you feel that they can and will deliver?
Yeah, I think when you published Rewarding Talent, you put it, or you showed it very clearly. We only had 10 points out of 30 possible points when it comes to attractiveness of the ESOP scheme. So the problem we always had were twofold. One, we had the issue of dry income. So you were taxed even before you got money from the exit. And the other problem is bureaucracy. Because we have very strong minority shareholder rights here in Germany. So once you become a shareholder, once you exercise your option, you would, for example, be able to block a capital increase or to block an acquisition, etc., which obviously is a bit tricky. What Germans ended up doing was creating virtual share option schemes, which is basically mimicking the value of option schemes, but it's really a bonus scheme. And the problem for those is, A, you don't really feel like an owner because you are not a shareholder. And secondly, it's also taxed at income taxes plus with social contributions. So it's prohibitively expensive. We've had amazing discussions, really, really good constructive discussions over the last 2 years with the different ministries that are kind of touching that problem. I think, and more has changed in the last 2 years that has probably changed in the prior 10 years. As Jörg alluded to in the previous session, we're really confident that the government has come up with a really attractive scheme, or like for the first step towards a really attractive scheme, I would say. So what we know so far, and we don't know all the details, it's definitely going to solve the dry income problem, making it more possible to go with normal options. The two questions that still remain to be answered for us is the bureaucracy problem. So what about the minority shareholder rights? Can you actually really become a shareholder as an employee? And the other question is really the applicability that we're looking forward to solve, or to see the details on that. Meaning, is it only applicable to companies that are up to 2 or 3 or 4 years old, or is it also applicable to companies that are 10 years old? Because we want to make sure that we are not only helping companies start, but also helping companies scale. I think we now have a lot of companies that are starting, but now is, for me, the next 10 years is about finding enough scale-ups in Europe, not only about creating enough startups in Europe.
Yeah, and that reflects very much the data we heard earlier from Joram about how much seed capital Europe's been successful in raising, and it's the later stages, right? So, Petrus, I'd love to bring you in at this point. So you've heard there a couple of examples of efforts in member states to bring about change. So from your perspective, why do you think there has been hesitancy to act on the issue of stock options up to now? And do you think that times might be changing now?
Well, I mean, I think I wouldn't necessarily call it hesitancy. We have a lot of good practice. And that's what we also want to highlight in the Startup Nation Standard, which I think you heard about earlier, saying that we don't have to always just look to Silicon Valley, Israel, other good examples, which we do look to, but that we have a lot of good practice here in Europe. So in the case of stock options, in your own not optional ranking, we see that Estonia is at the very top, ahead of countries like Israel and Canada even. France is right there as well, also in a very good situation, with Portugal and the UK soon behind that. And we heard already just today, which I was thrilled to hear from the Ministry of Finance, who we talk to often on various issues, that Germany is going to apparently, hopefully solve this issue, which has definitely been a bone of contention for one of the most dynamic ecosystems. So I think there's definitely movement. One issue that was raised was that perhaps the talent population in Europe, I mean, there you get a little bit of a cultural issue, is not as aware and demanding of the stock options, partially because in many cases they haven't been there, and partially because it's been difficult to take them across borders. So with this convening power, with this standard, we're hoping, along with the startup associations, with the member states, to solve this, to have a even more conducive situation for issuing the stock options. Then we can move to better collaboration on ensuring the cross-border aspects. And the last thing I would say is on the connecting ecosystems, This is something that we try to do with Startup Europe. It was mentioned as one of the things that doesn't happen always in Europe, and also on the stock options. So this best practice in the detail, not simply we have stock options, they're taxed at the time of vesting and so on, but also these issues such as minority stakeholders, minority shareholders, shareholders voting rights and so on. We can really see what works best and not just simply look to California or Israel, which are again useful examples, but look to our own examples within EU law.
Thank you for that. And now, Andres, to bring you back in, because you've been obviously very involved in efforts in Latvia to look at improving the use of stock options and treatment of stock options. So what have you found to be the biggest barrier preventing change from happening, and how have you tried to overcome that? What have you been, what have you found works?
Yeah, so naturally we have the Estonians next door, and since they're top of the list, then it's our natural comparison point on everything. And so you know, we want our startups to have the same kind of opportunities that Estonian startups do. And in fact, if you look at the Pan-Baltic picture, the Lithuanians actually have pretty attractive setup as well. And so, you know, once we fix this in Latvia, we feel this region will in fact be showing the way for perhaps other member states. The biggest problem we've faced is simply the finance ministry's hesitation, unwillingness to actually look beyond. They're always thinking about, you know, my next 6 months or 12 months tax revenues. Is this going to take away, you know, well-paid corporate jobs? And you know, and there's this concern about the risks. And this difficulty for them to look beyond that with the sort of the optimist that naturally us as investors and founders have of, you know, what the potential is, and that if you look a couple of years down the road, you could have huge windfalls, right, that are coming into the tax system from these success stories, right, which are actually funded by, you know, investors from elsewhere in the world, right? Because we don't, in this small region, we're not going to have, you know, massive growth funded investment funds. So that sort of worry is kind of clouding things. And when you're sitting in a parliamentary commission and the parliamentarians have no idea what stock options are, they've never been in business, it's very easy for a finance ministry official to scare them into, oh my God, this is going to be, you know, a tax evasion scheme and you're going to lose tax. So this is the sort of environment you're in. And so it takes, you know, a concerted effort by the ecosystem to push this forward. And I think the European Commission's initiative on the Startup Nation Standard is exactly the kind of thing that we need. These kind of events, this kind of standard, which is also saying it's not just the US and Silicon Valley, but right here in Europe, we have examples of how all these member states could be all benefiting from this kind of this kind of change.
Yeah, and Liz, who do you think are the most important voices, or maybe the most important data points that you can leverage to try and get the message across, to try and get government to sit up and listen, and you know, finance ministries to sort of become less anxious, to Andres's point?
Well, I remember being at an event where we were encouraged how to engage with policymakers as startup representative bodies, and they shouted the words jobs, 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 jobs. And that is, you know, always a key consideration for policymakers. Ultimately, what impact is this going to have, and in terms of providing opportunities for people. So for us in an Irish context, in terms of jobs, it's not just a job is a job is a job, it's actually a job in a rural area. So for us, we're trying to really communicate that actually startups are well placed to provide these distributed jobs. We're now all remote, but they naturally start being quite flexible. And in Ireland, we have hugely successful startups in rural areas. So that's something that politicians are particularly keen about. But then when it gets to policymakers, so the civil service side, dealing with ministries for finance, I'm sure we could all share notes. Latvia is probably very similar to Ireland, it's their job to make sure that they're preventing loopholes from being introduced. I think that's where having very active, very honest engagement, it's not in our interest either that something happens in 3 years' time, the scheme gets shut down. So it's really making sure that they're being risk averse, but they're also enabling opportunities, and that they see that the kind of tax income that can ultimately be brought in to offset that tax lost.
Completely. And Gloria, yeah, in Germany, and yeah, hopefully on the cusp of some major changes. But yeah, there were some really quite big voices in the ecosystem that sort of, you know, we heard voicing how the importance of this issue. Do you think that made much of a difference in getting government to listen, or has it been a slower, more sort of bottom-up attrition process?
I think it has helped tremendously, because we've really had an open dialogue. I think the ministries were always really open to engage and really listen. I think that we found it to be very constructive. And I think all of us, or probably at least most of us, were really, really constructive. So we really wanted to work alongside them and together with them to exactly avoid the loopholes, avoid creating those loopholes that could result from all of this, from the changes. So I think we've definitely had our voices heard, but it was also, what was really important for us was that it was just not only 2 or 3 people standing there and fighting for it, but it was really the whole ecosystem, and we were really being able to collect the voices from the whole ecosystem, also through a study that we conducted where we asked about 2,000 people working in the ecosystem, not just founders, also employees, and really try to get all the voices heard, and not just those that are screaming the loudest, I would say.
Yes, and Petrus, so yeah, I suppose if the holy grail is to have an EU-wide stock option scheme, as you say, with portability, etc., you know, what's the role of the Commission on trying to bring that about, and what is going to be with member states? What's the interaction, or you know, how? And I'm gonna put you on the spot and say, if you had to guess how many years it might be before we might see some EU-wide scheme, how many years should we be thinking about?
I mean, we have different policy and legislative tools. We can legislate, for example, recently with the Markets in Crypto Assets, the Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act very soon. We can also issue policy instruments like the SME and startup policy, which has the regulatory sandboxes. We can have regulatory sandboxes, which we're setting up one with the European Blockchain Partnership. And then finally, we can convene with instruments like the Startup Nation Standard, which can lead to eventually a harmonizing regulation. But first, you should see that there are problems of fragmentation. It's necessary to say in this area, one of the most sensitive areas, and this is something that everyone has indicated, Anders, just moments ago, and the other colleagues, Liz and so on, that we have the tax area, which is much less easy for us to move on or to have harmonization, probably for good reason. I mean, this is an issue very close to domestic politics. So I would imagine first we start with the Startup Nation Standard. We start with everyone really trying to have the stock options as something that is seen as the best way to move forward, to have the most vital startup ecosystem. And then if we still have issues of fragmentation and a lack of harmonization, that the EU can return to this issue, or a perhaps legislative instrument, but this is not something that I would predict in the near future, again, because tax policy is so much subject to domestic legislation.
So what would be your advice to people who might be listening, who are trying to bring about action and reform in their individual member states? What would you be telling them is like the sort of best way that they can push this forward and support what's happening?
Be organized through the startup associations. We have Deutsche Startups, we have Scale Up Ireland here, we have Startup LV and Tech Hub Riga. So I mean, this is the great example. I think these are in most, if not all, member states. Really talk to your legislators, your ministries. It's not always so simple as Andres mentioned, and also Liz and Gloria mentioned in various contexts. We see progress now in Germany. Hopefully we see progress in Latvia. Point out the advantages of the countries like Estonia and France and Portugal, which are known startup centers. And you can always clearly point to the European Commission, not that we're any kind of, how to say, arbiters of everything, and certainly not at all in tax policy, but that we also, based on our analysis and our evaluation of the global startup scene and scale up options, that stock options are definitely one of the ways to go forward. And it's also a fair, employee-centric way of development. So it also fits in a lot of ways the European model.
Thank you, thank you. There's one more question I just wanted to throw in, really, for anybody who might have a view on this. Given the what's happening with the pandemic and COVID, etc., it's it's clearly causing a lot of reevaluation, but it's also and perhaps some more, in some ways it might create openness to change and to new thinking, but it's also, as a crisis, it brings its own immediate demands and things which are more tactical. So do you think that people have a view on whether actually coming out of this crisis is a positive opportunity, or it actually might take things back a step because there are so many other big issues that policymakers have to deal with?
I might jump in from an Irish perspective. We've formed, along with other partners who are aligned with us, particularly around capital. Actually, for us, early stage capital is a big issue in Ireland, unlike some of the data you were talking about earlier across Europe. But we have formed the Alliance for an Innovation-Driven Recovery. And that's where I think it's a case of actually looking ahead and thinking, where is that future growth going to come from? And it's the countries that choose on that, take the time to think about that and give some headspace to looking forward, will really win out. So there is definitely an opportunity for them to really understand how to support innovation in each country, but it's whether they take the time to do that or not.
Yeah, I would second that. And I think actually for the smaller countries in Europe, in some sense, this is a bigger opportunity, because as the pandemic is accelerating the spread of remote work, distributed teams, we're certainly in Latvia, we're seeing founders come back from the US. We're seeing a definite increase in interest in building teams here, because there's now an understanding that this is not just a couple of months of lockdown and we'll be back to business as usual. There are some fundamental changes in the way things are operating, in the way customers are used to buying, and the way teams are used to running their business. And so for our countries, I think a lot of the politicians as well see this as an opportunity for startups to grow faster, to be a bigger part of the economy. So while there is pain, in our part of the economic system, it's definitely seen as something that can really help solve.
Thank you very much for that. And I think we've got to bring things to a close there. But I'd like to say thank you to all the panelists very much. And it was great to see you all again. And I hope to be able to see you all at some point soon-ish, face to face. But the next session is going to broaden this talent discussion beyond stock options to look at how else Europe's ecosystems can attract and nurture the smartest and most ambitious people that are out there. But until that starts, thank you, everybody, and goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Welcome to our discussion on making Europe the most welcoming continent for startup talent. I'm Benedict from Allied for Startups. We're a global association of startup associations ranging from Startup Canada to France Digital, bringing the voice of startups to the policy debate. Talent, with a focus specifically on startup visas, has been a founding priority of our organization. So we're delighted to cooperate with Not Optional and Slush to discuss this issue today. In the next half an hour or so, we will deep dive into how startup talent is attracted to given ecosystems, learning from the stories and experiences of this very distinguished panel, and then hone in a bit more where startup visas fit in this picture and what we can learn from tech visa schemes across Europe and what else we can do to attract skilled workers to Europe. With me to discuss this are Sean Keane, Chief People Officer at Farfetch, a former startup that I'm sure you all know, which now employs thousands of people in many countries. Also, we're joined by Eve Peterson, who recently became head of Startup Estonia, a country we all know as a trailblazer in startups and scale-ups. Also with us is Joop van der Voort, successful serial entrepreneur who is now the CEO at remote.com. And last but not least, Gon Sanchez, founder and writer at Seed Table. Now, let me tee off our conversation here. We all know that while there are many important ingredients in a thriving startup ecosystem, talent is probably the key one. It all begins and ends with having talented folks from diverse backgrounds who are ambitious and have an entrepreneurial mindset. And we would say at Allied for Startups that COVID-19 has just magnified this truth. COVID has exposed the ability of startups to react to big challenges. Over 20% of startups actually pivoted their business model in the immediate aftermath of the first wave, from tracing apps to telemedicine. So it's hard to imagine any other economic sector making such a U-turn to serve European societies. It shows us that there's so much more potential with these ambitious entrepreneurs for our green and digital recovery. As Neil Reimer from Index said at the outset, over 2 million people work in startups today. But when it comes to unleashing talent, today's event shows that we're still not quite there yet. So we're facing the question today, what can we do to make Europe the most attractive place to start up? I'd like to begin by asking Sean, what's the role of foreign talent in building a successful startup and in startup ecosystems?
Hi, Benedict, thank you so much. I mean, I think the role really is about making sure that you have access to the talent because obviously, as you mentioned, we've moved on from being a startup into much more of an established business. But with that, it's really been able to help us to analyze the data of where the talent is coming from and moving to. And what we found, certainly over the course of the last 2 years, if we look particularly in our product, tech, data sectors, talent coming into Europe can represent, 40% or more of our specialist roles. And so I think this access to talent, certainly across Europe and more broadly globally into startups is essential for being able to build that talent pool.
Could you maybe unpack a bit more about how talent is moving broadly between ecosystems and why do startup ecosystems act as a big cluster of talent?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think there's probably an attraction. Certainly people will go where the work is, that's by the nature of who we are as human beings. And so I think as talent hubs centralize around certain geographies, so does that attraction to talent to those areas. And then the community around that starts to build to support that talent to have, a very high quality of life. We've seen that absolutely evolve in Portugal, for example. Farfetch has been around for 12 years. And when I first joined Farfetch 8 years ago, Portugal wasn't necessarily the place to go for technology talent. And now it's probably one of the, most attractive places to be in Europe, amongst other communities, of course. So I think it's a mixture of talent going where the work is, where the attractive work is, and then the communities around them being built to support the infrastructure for them.
Maybe bringing in another practitioner, your startup remote.com tries to make the life of businesses hiring talent easier. Maybe you can kick us off by giving us a 30-second elevator pitch about remote.com.
Yeah, of course, Benedict, thanks. So what we do is to just make it possible to hire people in other countries. It's as simple as that. So what I found in the past in other companies is that you find someone great, they live in a different country, you make them an offer, they say yes, and now you're stuck with, how do I pay them? How do I provide them benefits? And how do I do this in a way that's easy for them and easy for me as a business? And what I found in the past is that there really is no way. Like, you either have to set up a local entity and go through all of what is necessary to set up there, which is, I mean, I now know, very hard and very different across different countries. Or you can hire them. It's really as simple as that. And so we do that for you, and we do that for businesses. So we act as a local employer of record. We did all that hard work. We set up in every country in the world, and we take care of payroll, benefits, compliance, taxes, and everything that comes with employing someone locally.
So viewers will also be able to see from the cool gear you have around you that you're also a successful podcaster. And I think your podcast is about remote working. With COVID-19 and everybody here becoming experts on Zoom calls and working remotely, will we even still need startup ecosystems to cluster and cross-pollinate by having entrepreneurs being in the same place at the same time?
I'm not sure if we need it, but I think the important thing to acknowledge is that it's kind of nice to be together. That's, people that, like myself, that advocate for remote work, we don't necessarily advocate for a world in which we're all working from home all the time, let alone being forced to do so because of a pandemic. We believe that it's a great freedom to be able to work from wherever you want, but it doesn't mean that it's not nice to be together. And actually, what I find is that a large majority of people enjoy working from wherever they want. It might be from home, but at least part of their time spent together with other people, working or not. And so, yeah, there's good reason for ecosystems to exist. And in addition to that, it's important for there to be a place to get together, to work together, to find peers, to connect with other similar businesses. That historically has always been a great driver of creativity, to see other people working and to hear from their ideas. So yeah, there's absolutely a need for this. No one wants to be sitting always at home all of the time.
It's great to hear that from the startup entrepreneurs and the ecosystem experts, that there's still a need and desire for this. So regardless of COVID, that ecosystems still act as a hotbed and a cluster of talent. And I mean, maybe taking this a step further, startup visas are an important instrument in this process, right? To attract founders and high-skilled talent from abroad. Now, Eve actually runs the startup visa scheme in Estonia. Eve, maybe could you take a minute to just run us in the audience here through how the startup visa actually works in practice?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. Yeah, we're really lucky that this program got started in 2017. We got really great trust from the Prime Minister in 2016, and it took less than a year to actually get from idea to launch. And it's been working better than it was expected even. I think people were thinking 50 applicants maybe will come in the first year. Actually, the number was 300 or so. And it's been kind of steady since then. So to go over briefly, an applicant can then apply for a startup visa, during which process they need to prove that they are an actual startup with a business model that is scalable, innovative, and has a technological component. So they need to have a team, and they need to present all kinds of materials to a startup committee. This all is done in a special system, which was also created by an Estonian startup. So there, the committee takes a look at this application and verifies whether this idea or a company or a team truly is a potential startup. The committee is comprised only of experienced community members. They are startups themselves or investors. They have quite a bit of knowledge in that area. So if that startup idea or a team gets a yes, they get a unique code, which they can then use to apply for a visa or a temporary residence permit in an easier way. So this is in general how it works. And so far, let's say from 2017, if we take a look at the whole number of startups that have been established, then from the 730 new companies, 30% are founded by foreign founders. So this is quite a significant number, and we do see that the program is working, and we just need to kind of keep it updated from now on.
You're preempting my next question, actually. I was going to ask you to share how many startups have actually gone through this, and maybe even if you could share like a prominent example or success stories for the viewers.
Yeah, well, actually there was a startup, Original My, which just won at the, what was it called, AIM contest in Dubai, among hundreds of startups as the winner. So they created sort of a software to use for digital signing of documents. So we're really proud of them, and they're really active, and they're really showing the example to other foreign founders how to kind of blend in and make use of the ecosystem.
One of the things I think is really exciting about your scheme is that members of the startup community are actually in the decision-making process in deciding who's getting the visa or not. So constantly you're able to meet the demand and to be plugged into the ecosystem directly. I'd like to turn to Gons. Gons, you've built yourself a reputation in the ecosystem as the guy who collected all the startup visas and compared and contrasted them. In your experience, how do you rank Estonia's startup visa?
Yeah, so if I think about sort of the best in class startup visas, for me, Estonia is one of the obvious answers. So thanks to my work at C-Table and my previous work as head of growth at a company called Jobatical, which is an immigration software company based in Tallinn, I had sort of first row seats to the power of a great startup visa scheme, both for highly skilled immigrants and for founders. So if you're a company hired from abroad, you can get someone in Estonia working in a matter of weeks. State fees are extremely affordable, it's family friendly, and just a great testament to how good this program is that many Estonian companies and startups are powered by foreign talent.
Mm-hmm. I think you're on the right track. Maybe you can reflect on your spreadsheet and tell us which countries you think are the absolute best in class next to Estonia, and maybe also who are the worst offenders when it comes to that business.
Yeah, absolutely. So France is also another great example. What La French Tech is doing with the French Tech visa, it's just fantastic, both for employees, for founders, and for investors. So they have very quick processing times. It's family friendly. It's valid for 4 years, which is also very important when planning long term. And finally, it's diploma agnostic. Essentially, you don't need to have a university diploma to get a sort of a startup visa in France. And I think that's going to be increasingly more important as time goes on, as we find sort of new alternative education methods. There are other countries where the program sort of makes sense, like Spain, but only if you really know your way around the system and the bureaucracy. But I'd say that France and Estonia are sort of the best in class in Europe right now. Outside Europe, if you want to take a look at something that's interesting, then the Startup Chile program is a great place to look at. The program has changed a lot over time, but they were the pioneers of the startup visa schemes. When I'm thinking about the worst offenders here, I'm going to sort of go a bit outside Europe, and I'm going to say that the US is the worst offenders. So as America becomes more inwards looking, and the visa suspension stuff imposed by President Trump is just one example, this probably won't change anytime soon. That said, the fact that the US is the worst offender doesn't save us or free us from doing the work. So Europe is fragmented across a bunch of different things, and immigration laws is just another one. So even though we have some of the best in-class programs, many of the programs that we have need work. And I can point to a bunch of different examples, But one is, for instance, the Portugal startup visa that requires to be part of one of their certified incubators to get the visa. And that's, for instance, that's some unnecessary red tape. And second, the fact that the US isn't doing great is also an opportunity for us. It's not just something that saves us from the work. Historically, the US has been the place where ambitious people go to start companies. Like, for instance, about 45% of Fortune 500 companies were founded by immigrants or their children. And I think that is changing. So with the US becoming more inwards, Europe has now the opportunity to become the default place, the default path for ambitious founders looking to start world-changing companies. So I think we should take on to that opportunity and go do the work.
That's a great responsibility also to pass it back to Yves, actually. Now, at Allied for Startups, one of our calls has been for a European startup visa. And in your list, Gons, there's over 30 startup visas listed in Europe alone. Now, I'm going to ask this question to Yves. If the EU had the competence to make a European startup visa, what would you change compared to the Estonian startup visa?
What would I change that is not here in place at the moment?
Yeah.
Good question. I was just thinking about what would be the ideal, visa. I'm sure there are many reasons why we can't have the ideal one, because there are a lot of personal information that cannot be changed. From our point of view, it would be great to know, after the applicant has actually got the visa, to know when the person arrives in the country, so that we could kind of blend them in our community and help them succeed. So I think it's a good ideal. Maybe someday it can work somehow, but now I know, there is a lot of personal information involved, which we cannot have at the point we want.
Interesting. Now, I want to bring back Joop. Some startup visas are targeted not just at early stage founders, but also early stage employees. Early stage founders might be looking for high skilled developers who are scarce in any ecosystem. So what if startup visas extended to high skilled talent? Would this make talent flow easier for remote.com, but also in your perspective broadly for the ecosystem?
Yeah, this would benefit anyone. It's an unnecessarily high threshold to hire people from other countries. It's incredible how hard it is to do that. Whereas what we see is that talent is virtually fully distributed. Like we have amazing people working for us and working for our customers from literally any country in the world. Yet, if you're unlucky about where you were born, or unlucky with your prospective employer in the sense that they're not able to, pass that threshold, then they're not able to pay you, or you're not able to get a high-paying job or a good job in the first place. And so, yes, this would make a massive difference. It'd be great for us because it's been very hard to operate in many different countries at the same time. But it would be even greater for everybody else. Like it'd make an amazing change.
Great. I realize I might have been a bit of a softball question, but it's still good to get it on record from you.
Yes.
Maybe, we have, I think, around 10 minutes left. So I wanted to kind of take it back to the global perspective. Now, Sean, Farfetch, you said, employs thousands of people and is coming from the startup ecosystem itself. What's your experience at Farfetch generally with accessing talent through visas? And how could the process be made simpler for you at Farfetch?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the two biggest concerns that we have with accessing talent is firstly, we're desperate to get our hands on the global talent because, like you have said, we want talent to work in anywhere, but more broadly, if we want to bring them to an area that we have our offices, pre-COVID world, there's a huge amount of red tape to go through to do that, whether you're a startup or an established business. So the two things that I think are frustrating that I'd love to see change is the overall cost, because it's not just the visa cost itself, it's everything around the relocation, which sometimes can be, double or more, depending on the country that you're moving to or from, in the overall relocation for rounded experience. And then secondly is the time. You know, there is time associated to the visas that you see in all of the documents, but often visa processes get blocked or delayed, and that has a real detrimental effect on the business, particularly if you're a startup and you're wanting to get products and services developed.
Maybe could you just unpack that maybe with an example on talent flows? What are some of the best tech talent related policies you've come across globally? You know, I can imagine you must be plugged into many different ecosystems. So what's it like navigating that, and you know, what's kind of been the easiest government bureaucracy for you to be hiring talent with?
I'm not sure there is an easy one. I'd be lying if I said that there was. I'm afraid it doesn't matter what region you're in or what visa process you've got. I haven't seen a visa process work in any region that we've recruited from or to where it hasn't been caught up in some sort of delay or red tape or additional cost. I'm afraid. Sorry to not be more positive on that one.
I think it shows, it speaks to the fact that there's room for improvement, and to the title of the whole event here, that Europe has an opportunity to move forward and set a new benchmark. I'd like to bring in Gons again to kind of compare us to maybe some of the other big ecosystems. You already started doing a little bit of a comparison, Gons. Is there any best practice in other countries, maybe other tech leaders like Israel, that you think we should be adopting here in Europe tomorrow?
Great question. So I did a comparison to the US. So let me talk a bit about the best practices. So for employees, for instance, like the two things that I think are key right now are fast processing times, just like Sean mentioned. And because, for instance, team leaders at companies don't want to wait like 6 or more months for an engineer, and startups don't have that luxury of waiting. And then finally, like no diploma required, like because this disqualified many fantastic employees. Like there are other things that are important, like for instance, allowing family members. But funny enough, it rarely is about the cost. Companies are willing to pay a fee or a third party for talent. We see that with recruiters all the time, for instance. The main problem is the complexity and the red tape around it, the waiting times and the lack of transparency. So anything we can do to streamline that process, make it faster, make it transparent, and make it democratic, I think that's something we need to implement yesterday, not tomorrow.
Like the ambition. Before we go to wrap up, I wanted to bring in Job one more time, because you laid out at the start how rules and regulations can be, you know, difficult for your startup remote.com. I guess that's part of what you're setting out to help others navigate. Now, I'm sure when you speak to politicians, they would say, now we have these rules and regulations for good reasons. We want to know who you are and protect employees and all of that. And at the same time, imagine you saying that you're actually trying to make their lives easier. So do you have an idea how we can be making some of these rules easier, less painful for you, I guess, without scrapping them?
I think it's good to think about first principles here. What do you want to achieve as a government? And if you think about talent, what you see is that if people in your country or even from other countries and coming into your country have the ability to earn significantly more money through ways and still pay taxes locally, that's good for everybody, and everybody enjoys from that, including the government itself. And what we see is that we get an enormous amount of pushback from even just us trying to bridge that, and for us giving opportunities to local talent and trying to help other organizations bridge the massive bureaucratic gap here. So yeah, what are you hoping to achieve by making it hard for companies to employ people in your country or vice versa? Because ultimately it benefits everybody when, you know, a young person out of university joins a startup that blows up, and the startup might be in a different country, but they'll end up making an incredible amount of money over which they will pay taxes. So it benefits everybody. And really, that's how I think about it. Yeah,
I think that's really inspiring, actually. So wrapping up, I'd like to give everyone, 20 seconds, 30 seconds to share a final thought, or any big announcements you have, or say anything where I had to cut you off. or to make your one pitch to your one ask to policymakers in attendance here. Maybe starting with Sean.
So my 20 seconds is that from all the analysis that we've done alongside local talent, and part of the reason why we would want the visa processes improved is that it's proved that our people that we have recruited into either Portugal or the UK from other regions over the last year represent 80% of our high performers at 8%. So I would say it's absolutely worth the investment.
Super. Eve.
Yeah. First of all, I wish everybody would come to Estonia to work. So everybody who's listening, this is my pitch for Estonia. But on the serious side, I hope really that the government keeps their trust in the startup as the new economy that will kind of bring us all into a better future. And that's my faith.
Guns?
Yeah, +1 to what Eve said. Estonia is fun. But my advice to policymakers is that talent and the technology companies that hire them are your customers or your users. So in like typical startup lingo, I'd say go talk to them, understand what their needs are, figure out how you can help them, and then go do the work.
We have a massive opportunity in Europe, especially related to the things that are happening in the United States, as Gons mentioned, to really become a startup hub. But we really need to get our shit together on a bunch of things. We need to make it easy to work across borders. We make it easy to receive stock options and issue those to your employees. And it should be understandable how to deal with anything that comes with that, whether that's taxes or immigration or visas. If we nail those things, and we really can, because it happens elsewhere in the world, we have a massive opportunity of becoming the future startup hub of the world.
Now, on that upbeat note, I'd like to thank you all for this amazing conversation. I think in 30 minutes, we covered a lot of ground here. Startup visas are an important tool in the policy kit to kickstart our economies post-COVID and leverage startups' growth. We're at Allied for our startups, we're really enthusiastic about the potential of startup visas and maybe even a European approach on startup visas. Now, for now, I'd like to thank the panelists for their contributions, for putting up with me as an impatient moderator, and to Not Optional and the team behind it for this super timely event. We're looking forward to the next agenda item and are now throwing the virtual baton over to the fireside chat. Thank you, everyone.
a joy to be joining you at Not Optional. My name is Caroline Hyde. I have the great pleasure of being an anchor for Bloomberg Television right here in very grey New York. But today we have got a fireside chat for you. So I know the fires are roaring across in Estonia. Next with, of course, Taavet Hinrikus joins us, co-founder, chairman now of TransferWise. And also to join us in this free-flowing conversation that I know it will be, John Collison, of course, co-founder of Stripe, who's currently in Europe as well, I think, especially for this sort of an event. But I want this to be fast-flowing, free-talking, enjoyable, and really putting to bear what we are wondering about, where Europe is at in terms of its tech infrastructure, its tech investment, and its tech talent. And kudos to Slush and to Index Ventures for putting this event on. And let's get straight to it, because, gentlemen, it is a joy to be joined by both of you. And Taavet, kick us off, if you will, because we all spend our times trying to compare how Europe is compared to Silicon Valley. How is it doing versus China? From your perspective, you've been in the game for a while, having built your business from scratch and now billions in terms of valuation. What does Europe look like to you as an angel investor and as a founder?
I think Europe is doing awesome right now. So if I think back when we started TransferWise almost 10 years ago, it was way, way different. You know, we actually went to US to raise our money. We raised seed A, B, C from US. We actually got our D round and later from Europe. If you think about talent, if you think about infrastructure, a lot has changed. So I think we're in a golden age of Europe. The capital is available. We have more raw talent in Europe than we have in the US. Also, I think people's attitudes are finally changing. It used to be that when you fail as a founder in Europe, some people look at it like, "Ooh, this kind of stinks. Like, you know, this guy failed." Like, I think we're starting to embrace failure a little bit more. So, you know, it's just a matter of time until we're really going to catch up to US and China, in my mind.
John, does Silicon Valley care? You're a European who left for the US to start raising your money for founding Stripe. Does Silicon Valley care about how big Europe is?
I think Europe cares too much what Silicon Valley thinks. I think that there tends to be a lot of talking about catching up to the US and China and various things like that. But as Taavet said, the fundamentals are fabulous in that, you know, you have, as a bloc, Europe has the largest density of software engineering talent. We know there's a really strong base of hard tech investment. I mean, we look at the progress here on the, you know, the Oxford COVID vaccine and lots of other things as we look at, you know, AI. It's where Facebook's, you know, AI headquarters in Paris and things like that. But I think fundamentally we kind of look at it from the wrong perspective with too much comparison. Like, yes, obviously it's the case that it's gotten so much better. You know, I grew up in Ireland and then, you know, first moved to the United States in, I guess, 2009. In 2009, when I left the US, it was a barren wasteland of a fundraising environment. I mean, you know, the notion that you could scrape together a Series A from, you know, a small handful of investors and maybe government grants or something, that was an achievement. And now you have, like Taavet said, there are Series D and Series E from European investors and these very large investment rounds without really anyone batting an eye. And so what I get excited about are all the specific areas where I think, you know, European startups are best set up to compete and to win on a global basis, and we can get into some of those.
Yeah, I mean, delve into that, John, because fintech was always what was held up and lauded as the area of expertise. London is the hub of that, but you've built your fintech in Silicon Valley. Like, where is the opportunities in particular with Europe, do you think?
Well, we haven't in that we obviously got our start in the United States. We're in college for it there, but, you know, now our international headquarters is in Dublin. We have a large business in Europe. We actually just announced the acquisition of a company called Paystack last week. They are headquartered in Nigeria and they are building the Stripe for Africa. And I actually think expanding to African countries is one of the very big opportunities that European companies have available to them. As you mentioned, fintech, I think that's a big one. Actually, Taavet, I'd be curious for your thoughts on this. But I think it's really interesting to contrast the difference in the American mindset towards enabling all this stuff versus the European mindset, where Americans have a bit of this view. There's the famous Ronald Reagan line that the 9 scariest words in the English language are "I'm from the government and I'm here to help," and you can kind of see that in not much happens in the way of enabling frameworks and standards and technology. Whereas I think in the European landscape, you tend to get much more in the way of active regulators looking to enable markets developing. And so with fintech, it isn't that fintech just accidentally sprung up in Europe. You had the notion of passporting, where you can get licensed in one country and then passport it to other European countries, which is something both Stripe and TransferWise take advantage of. You've all the developments with PSD2, you've the banking regulatory sandboxes and things like this. But there's lots of active work that made things like Stripe and TransferWise possible from a framework perspective. And I get excited about, there are probably future areas where we should be applying that thinking. Look at VAT, which is a mess right now. Look at digital identity, where we need much more to be improved. And so that would be probably one example. I would say, there is an approach that brought fintech about, and we can probably take that approach and apply it to other areas.
Tarvik, your thoughts?
I mean, I think, John, you said a lot of this already. I would just maybe start also from actually, if you're building a global business, which both of our companies are global, like we have more than a dozen offices around the world, it's actually a whole lot easier to manage that from Europe. There's a reason you're camping out in Europe right now. It's just easier, let's be honest about it. Time zone wise, you can call California and you can call Singapore in the same day. Try doing it from one of these places. So it's just, logistically much easier. But, we've gotten a lot right for fintech regulation. I mean, in the US, for many things, you have state-by-state regulation. In Europe, it's an equal size opportunity. I say we're talking 500 million people in both, well, a bit less, but, in Europe, you have one regulator. It's no accident that we chose UK to be our headquarters, because the UK regulator already back then was showing signs of promise. And I still think FCA is keeping the leading spot as a regulator, and there's the way passporting works. So the way European Union is making a digital single market, I think there's a lot more to be done, but they're actively trying to create an environment. They have made it a much more level playing field. If you look at, we were the first non-bank to get access to the payments infrastructure in the UK. We still haven't gotten it everywhere in Europe, and there's more that the regulator should do. But I think there's a lot happening, and the world is also paying attention and copying a lot what's been done in the UK. So many regulators are saying that, hey, the FCA is our model, and we're trying to copy that. And, I think fintech and everything around it, fintech, insurance, and so on. Also, if you think of companies, we have Stripe, and, we have another similar company in Europe called Adyen. I don't even know which one is bigger. So I think Europe is ahead in fintech and everything around this. I think much more to come in various deep tech areas, whether it goes to health-related fields or climate, just the raw engineering talent coming from universities that will build a lot of exciting things.
Stripe is bigger in case you're wondering, yeah. But do you think there's also something, Tavis, where getting, companies that get their start in the US, you can live there and drive for 1,000 kilometers in any direction, and you're still in, exactly the same kind of culture, from which you started, more or less. Whereas pretty early on, you have companies that grew up in the European environment working on cross-border, working on multi-currency, multi-language, working on localizing their products. And so I think you tend to see more of these globally minded companies, even at the Series A stage.
I totally agree. It's a mixed blessing. If you start a company in Europe, you end up, you might be lucky starting it in UK, which means you can grow this far. You might be unlucky starting in Estonia, which means you can only grow this far until you have to go elsewhere. If you start in the US, you have a huge market to go after, but that means you end up building a large business, a large organization that really can't think of languages, even time zones might be a challenge. Versus in Europe, you get a kick in the butt very quickly and you have to go outside. So I do think it is a structural advantage for us. And I think the European companies have become pretty good at figuring out their playbooks on this. And at the same time, we can see US companies, I think the last example was Robinhood, that figured Europe is too hard and will go back to US. So great. I'm sure there's going to be a dozen baby Robin Hoods coming up in Europe soon.
Is Europe, though, Tavet, making its life more difficult with Brexit? Is it making your life more difficult? Do you think that the regulators will be as seamless? Or is it affecting things?
Favorite topic, elections and Brexit.
And the virus.
Can we talk about elections next, please? So Brexit, it's obviously it's a huge issue for one country and a bit more of an issue for one union. I think in the tech world, actually, I would say, if you look at Europe, it doesn't matter. It matters for UK, it makes life harder in the UK, but Europe as a whole, London loses, Paris wins. I think, I believe we're living in a post-Silicon Valley world. We have many Silicon Valleys in Europe, London being one, Paris, Berlin, Tallinn. Like in Estonia, we have 5 unicorns for 1 million people. I mean, bloody hell, that's like, everyone has a personal unicorn soon. So I think, we're going to have many more tech capitals in Europe, which is good. Brexit will make things harder and it'll make things more harder for London and UK. But I think overall, we're going to move on. And, so people in tech are good at building. And if you're building, then, you just tend to overcome whatever gets thrown in the way.
And I can hardly keep up with your building, both of you. And talk to us about Stripe and the way it's evolving. I mean, you're now helping businesses have their own credit cards. You've been making purchases over in Africa, as you say, John. Your perspective on what policy barriers you're finding as you move into new regions such as Africa, as you're looking at expanding these new types of offerings. What more could Europe do potentially from a policy barrier perspective? Does anything need to get down?
Oh, absolutely. And it actually gets to the Brexit point, right? Where I think you could live too much in conceptual space and imagine that like we had this neat, orderly EU where everything was colored in on a map before, and then the UK exited it, and now everything is really hard and non-standardized. And look, there are kind of real, social, personal, business costs to Brexit, but we shouldn't kid ourselves about how standardized everything was before and how standardized everything is within the EU right now. And so, we talk a lot about the European single digital market. That is more of a conceptual aspiration than a reality. Cross-border commerce within the EU borders is still sub 20%, which seems kind of bonkers when you think that we should have solved all the barriers to intra-EU trade right now. And so just within our small parochial doing business online corner of things, absolutely standardizing across payment methods. SEPA was a good start for bank transfers. But one of the big things people come to Stripe to do is to make it so that they can accept any European payment method. That's what we're doing. We would love to see more standardization across sales tax, making it easy for a business to operate and to sell to any other business in Europe. Like I mentioned, we'd love to see more standardization across digital identity. The fact that both Tavet and I in our businesses, you need to do KYC checks or validate someone's identity for them to participate in the internet economy. There is no good online way to do that right now. And so I think that's rightly something that regulators and various businesses are looking at. But again, with Brexit, it's not like we went from a world where everything was perfectly standardized within the EU to now that's falling over. I think we actually still have a lot of, even just within EU countries, standardization to do. And that then applies as we go kind of further afield to regions like, expanding into Africa with Paystack, or we've lots of other international expansion happening. It's that same set of challenges that you need to do, where Stripe is fundamentally about providing a ubiquity and translation layer where everything works smoothly, but everything is different underneath the hood. And so we need to do the work to enable that.
Tavet, any policy wishes? You had your perspective?
I mean, first, John, if you mentioned ID verification, I think the leading ID verification companies are all in Europe. So, ping me later and I can put you in touch. I think when it comes to policy, lots is right, but there's still more to do. I think, the prime thing that I would think about is really making it a level playing field in Europe when it comes to banks and fintechs. There's a lot about access to payment infrastructure, which is still limited to banks only. I mentioned how we got access in the UK, but that took us about 7 years of lobbying and then 2 years of building. Great thing is that now everyone else has an easier way, and we're very happy to pave the way in other countries. But that's something where regulators could really come in and help. Digital single market is exists, but lots more to do. I mean, maybe I would add here labor, making the labor market more unified. You know, hiring, firing people is still very complicated in some countries, easier in others. You know, also the topic of stock options. You know, sadly, if you have people in every European country, that means it's a big mess because every country treats it differently from a tax point of view. So more to be done, you know, to make it a more single market, but we have the beginnings in place.
Beautiful segue there, Tavit, because of course this is basically what Not Optional is all about. They've already put out an open letter to Europe saying stock options is one area you could help us in terms of the fight for talent. I mean, over at Stripe, John, I'm seeing you pinch high-level executives from all over the place. You just got your CFO from GM, you've been hiring from Salesforce to head up the UK. But your perspective on tech talent in Europe, we heard from Tavit saying like the tech talent is actually deeper perhaps in Europe. Do you agree? Do you feel that anything could be made easier to ensure that you can continue to build?
I think Tavit's getting at the right issues. Look, one is stock options are something we should be highly encouraging of, in that they allow, in the case where people are building these large, valuable franchises, they allow that wealth that's created to be more dispersed, to be kind of more broadly owned, which I think is just straight up good from a policy perspective, and then instrumentally helps kickstart ecosystems. There's been a lot of talk and a lot of study about the fact that Silicon Valley, so many startups get funded because there are so many people out there as angel investors from previous companies, who write those checks, and you can kind of trace them.
Boom! I see from you. I see Retool. I see. You're busy in angel investing.
No, exactly. But and as you trace back the history of Silicon Valley, you see that Google begat by the generation of companies that came before it, and so I think we should clearly hope for that. I think another clear example is that, look, I don't think anyone holds up the United States right now as a paragon of a model of the right thing to do from an immigration point of view, and just like a smooth, well-run, orderly immigration apparatus. But fundamentally, people are building global companies and looking to attack. They're competing in global talent markets, and so I think the one question is how we make intra-EU mobility better, and how Brexit affects that, and things like that. But we are, for our again, Ireland is our international headquarters, and so we tend to be hiring people from all around the world to Ireland, and so I think in the competition for talent, making these places attractive, and just from a visas and systems point of view, making it easy for people to build global headquarters, that is what companies are looking to do, and I think that's what we need to enable.
John, does the virus change things, do you think? Will people need to move?
I mean, it'd be very odd if it didn't change things somewhat, but we're obviously working in a very different mode right now with COVID, and like a lot of companies, we have moved to a fully remote model, and we expect that to continue until the kind of the facts on the ground around vaccine distribution, or at least testing, enable us to do something differently. We were in a slightly different point coming into COVID because we already had a very international presence. We're not just all based in our, in San Francisco or anything like that. And we actually had lots of remote people already. But I would say, we'll have the real decisions around kind of if there are long-term changes we want to keep from the current mode a little bit more in 2021, when we have line of sight to what that looks like.
Tavit, how about you in terms of, do you think in any way the silver lining of this dark cloud that is COVID, that it levels the playing field, that you can be an engineer based in Estonia and Latvia and in Nigeria and come and work for TransferWise as easily and not have to move to London?
So I do love the idea how COVID shrunk the world, did a lot of positive changes in that sense. And I've been really amazed at seeing how the world has coped with it. Starting March and April, we were all kind of sent home, and you would have guessed that the world is going to stop and fall off a cliff. But guess what? Things kept on going. So I was like, oh wow, this is like pretty cool. Like we can actually do this. But now I've been super amazed at the last couple of months where on a couple of projects we've gotten actually people in a room to brainstorm and figure stuff out, and wow, that's really amazing. It still seems to me that magic happens when you put people in the same room around one pizza box and get them to figure stuff out. So I think we're going to go into some kind of new world where we're not expected to sit in the office 5 days a week. But I also don't believe in no offices at all. I mean, there are companies that make it work, that have a fully remote culture, but I think that will always be a minority. So I think most of the world will end up somewhere in the middle. So at TransferWise, we made a couple decisions now, which is one, first 3 days at home is very okay for everyone to do. But also I think the even maybe more exciting one is we've told everyone can spend 90 days a year working from anywhere they want. So if you want to go and camp out in Bali for 90 days and work from there, you're welcome to do that. So we'll see what the new normal is. It's probably early now to fully predict where we end up and when we end up there at all.
One thing that from our perspective, one thing that I think is really useful is just honestly teaches a large fraction of the company who, how to work remotely. Going into COVID, we were 20% remote, 80% in offices around the world. I think coming out of that, not only will we be a higher percentage remote, and we've had some people who have decided to move to be remote workers during it, but the other 80% or whatever it ends up being, now actually just understand instrumentally much better how to work within a remote culture. I think that is a very useful set of lessons that hopefully we're not going to forget, 12 months after things being somewhat back to normal.
There's a lot about the tooling, starting with should remote people be paid the lowest salary or the highest salary in the company? There's also we're using this fantastic thing called Zoom. I would be very surprised if in a couple of years' time, we don't have something better. I mean, it could still be from the company called Zoom, but I think, this is still very similar to when we invented video calling in Skype in 2004. So I think we'll see much better tooling and ways of working, which are more suited for this new age.
Javed, you started over at Skype, so if anyone knows the way video conferencing is going to go, you're a man who will know it. Talk to me about competition. And I mean, John, I feel like that was the ongoing thing as well. Not only was the cliche that we worry about valuations of Europe versus US and China, but we're also worried about does Europe inherently hate US tech giants in the way that we see the European Competition Commission really go after it. But what do you think about the way in which Europe looks at competition, fosters competition, and is it different from the United States, do you think, John?
Look, well, I mean, does Europe look at competition from a regulatory perspective differently? Yes, in that, the European competition framework versus the US antitrust framework, the former is, based on market share. The latter in America, they tend to look at consumer harm. And, this is the debates that are going on in America right now with something like Amazon, where it's like, well, it seems really good for consumers. So, where do you poke at it? But I also think that most businesses are actually not like the headline grabbing, giant market share, FANG, GAFA monoliths that people talk about, where, we would love if at Stripe our main problem was that there just wasn't competition. But luckily for consumers, we are not anywhere near that point. Instead, it's a very active space where any region we go into, we have a whole bunch of competitors, and that's part of the fun of it, honestly, right? Where you're constantly being businesses choosing Stripe or a competitor in our world, have options that are only a click away. And I think that's, part of the fun and the sport of it. And, I've loved watching similarly with Tavid and with TransferWise, where, clearly it is a space that was bereft of competition for a long time. And they've just, they're clearly having a lot of fun, just, poking in the eye the, somewhat lazy, entrants that needed some competition. But again, I think the arrival of TransferWise was much more effective from a competition point of view than hauling people in front of commissions would have been. I think that was clearly the recipe that was needed.
Yeah, Tavid, we miss the adverts. We need some more coming out.
Yeah, can you bring back the ads, Tavid?
Well, we keep on thinking about what clothes should we be ripping off next.
How much more naked can you get? Talk to us, Tavid, about, you're a very active angel investor, having become chairman over at TransferWise. I see you're in Radix, you're in couples counseling business. I think it's called Paired, you're in Catalog. There's so many areas you're looking at. What really excites you about some of the companies that are being born in Europe right now? Because it seems to be Europe that you're investing in.
Yeah, I think, you got to cut your focus somehow. So I tend to I tend to try to look at European things. And, truth be told, it's really a question about looking at what are the huge opportunities. You mentioned Get Peers, a couple counseling app, this is a somewhat of a taboo topic. Actually, probably a cultural difference between US and in US couples therapy is a much more accepted thing compared to Europe. So, it's a huge problem impacting a lot of people out there. So hey, there is no tool. Let's try to build one. And Kevin was a great guy to go at it. So let's give him a try and let's help him. And similarly, so many other things where you actually see digitalization hasn't quite happened yet. When we talk about competition, actually, I think most of the competition is still about the new way of doing things, which is online, and the old way of doing things, which is offline. Even when you look at Amazon, what's the share of e-commerce at Amazon? What's e-commerce's share of commerce? It's tiny. So, we are talking about helping the world get onto a digital track. And, that's actually a much more inclusive, much more level playing field for all consumers anywhere around the world.
And certainly that's another silver lining from this COVID is the shift that we see to e-commerce and hopefully that level playing field. John, I knew this time would fly away, and it has, because you're both so fun and amusing, but thoughtful. Talk to us, John, about what you'd say to the entrepreneurs out there right now, because that's what Not Optional is about. It's about helping entrepreneurs get onto the next level. It's about helping with policy making. What do you say to the entrepreneurs who are hoping to build a Stripe?
No, I think the main thing is that Stripe was kind of an obvious business to start when you think about it. If you just looked at the space. But I think everyone had been trained to think, oh well, payments must be broken because there's some need for it. Again, same with the TransferWise example. This must just be so expensive because that's how things work, and it just can't be fixed. There's the joke about The Economist. Their way of looking at the world where, they're walking down the street and they see a $20 bill, but they don't bend down to pick it up off the sidewalk. It's like, that can't be real. My eyes must be fooling me, because if it was real, someone would have picked it up by now. But, it's this notion that, the world is perfectly efficient. And I think that's the lesson for entrepreneurs. You have to train yourself to stop taking for granted and stop assuming that the adults are running the show, stop assuming that everything works the way it does for a good reason, and look out at all the, wide open opportunities there. And, we've touched on some of the, the areas that I think could be particularly interesting, fintech, or areas enabled by some of these new European frameworks that either exist or are in development. Tava talked about things that are newly enabled, by the internet, like couples therapy. One I'm really excited about is climate tech. I think, we just had our announcement of Stripe Climate yesterday, where we're letting businesses fund carbon removal from right within their Stripe account with kind of a percentage of sales. But that's a brand new space being invested in much more heavily in Europe than in the US, and one where I think we could see tons of entrepreneurs. But that will be the main one. I would encourage entrepreneurs to the mindset I would encourage them to have is stop assuming everything works the way it does for a reason.
I think if anything, every single economist has eaten a huge dose of humble pie in the last couple of quarters. So yeah, I hear that. And Tava, your perspective, any one piece of advice going out of this that you'd say to a young startup entrepreneur?
I think an old dog can't learn new tricks. So I kind of end up thinking back of the things which really helped us make things work at TransferWise. It goes back to find a huge problem, find something where you have room to build a global business and help people around the world, and then build a 10 times better solution. I mean, similar to what John says, take nothing for granted. Like, if I think about what people told me when starting Transfer, like, oh, this won't work because of this and this and this and this and this. I mean, we've proven that none of these things matter. So, but I think the basics are a 10x better solution for a huge problem, and then go give it a try. Like, you have to be ready to learn quickly, but then it's going to be a very fun ride.
Think big. I think that's the takeaway. Guys, I want to thank you both so much, giving us half an hour of your time, more than that, from your various outposts in Ireland and in Estonia. We wish you both keep happy, healthy, and enjoy your stints over in Europe and when you come traveling back to the UK. And I want to thank all those in the audience. I want to thank the organizers, of course. Big shout out to Wojtek there. And I'm going to hand things over to Anna from Slush now to wind things up.
Thank you, Caroline, and thank you to John and David. So hi, everyone. My name is Anna Briski, and I'm leading communication and PR at Slush. And as many of you know, Slush is a not-for-profit student-led movement, born out of the cold and slushy Helsinki, Finland. And for the past 10 years or so, our mission has been to support and grow these world-changing startups. And that's because we think startups are the best way to build the future. And we think those startups can be also built in Europe. And while Europe has already seen so many success stories like Stripe and TransferWise, there is a lot to bubbling under. And to make those stories true, those success stories true, we need to focus on enabling these companies to grow in Europe. And that's why we're here today. And based on today's discussions, I think we're heading to the right direction. Today we heard of Germany unveiling their new stock option plan in the matter of days, and also EU startup nation standard is rolling out in the beginning of next year. And we at Slush are more than excited to see where these discussions from today lead. And we are more than happy to be part of that work. So thank you everyone who joined today, especially our speakers such as Eva Kali, Liz McCarthy, Jeddah de Graaf, and of course David and John. We also loved seeing you, our audience, sharing your thoughts and ideas in the chat and on social media, and we hope this energy continues tomorrow. Speaking of tomorrow, we're having the most exciting program. First, we'll dive deeper into European IPOs, and then talk about the government's role in investments. And of course, the day will end with a look ahead of Portuguese presidency. So tune in tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. CET to catch the highlights of today, and 10:55 a.m. CET to hear Sifted's very own journalist Michael Stodhart's opening words. That's a wrap of today, and I thank you so much for joining, and I hope to see you tomorrow.